There is a version of this story that the federal government has already decided you should hear. In that version, 5 experienced park rangers died in a sudden weather event in the Rocky Mountain sector on a cold October morning. In that version, the supervising officer who sent them out that day suffered a psychological breakdown under the weight of grief and guilt, and everything he claims to have witnessed after the fact is the product of a mind that could not accept a tragedy it felt responsible for. That is a very clean story. It has clear causes and clear effects, and it closes neatly. The problem is that I have the footage. I have 43 minutes of a 12-year veteran ranger sitting alone in a mountain clearing, speaking calmly, describing a decision she was making, and then walking off camera without her equipment, without her beacon, without leaving a single footprint that leads anywhere a living person should be able to go. I have the memory card they did not know I had copied. I have the recording I made the morning I went back up that mountain alone, at 4 in the morning, and found something standing in the same clearing that I am still not able to fully explain to you. I am not going to tell you what to believe about any of this. I am going to tell you exactly what happened, in the order it happened, as accurately as I can reconstruct it. And at the end I want you to tell me what explanation fits all of the facts. Because I have been working on that question for 3 months, and I still do not have an answer that holds together completely. My name does not matter. My title is former district supervisor for the National Park Service. And this is the last record I am making of what happened to my team on October 14th. 3 months ago, I was a district supervisor for the National Park Service, overseeing a sector of the Rocky Mountain Range that most people will never see in their lifetime. The kind of terrain that makes you feel genuinely small, not in the way that postcards and travel brochures make it look, but in a way that settles deep into your chest and stays there, pressing against your ribs when you are trying to breathe at altitude on a cold morning. I had worked that sector for 11 years. I knew every trail designation, every elevation shift, every microclimate pattern that came rolling off those peaks in ways that could turn fatal before you finished your sentence on the radio. I thought I understood that mountain. I thought I knew every version of what it was capable of. I was wrong about all of that. I am telling you this from my apartment in Denver, sitting at a kitchen table that has 3 cold cups of coffee on it because I keep forgetting to drink them. I have not slept more than 4 hours in any single night since it happened. I am on mandatory administrative leave pending a psychological evaluation that I already know the outcome of before I walk through the door. I know because I have sat on the other side of that process enough times in my career to understand exactly how the language works, exactly what phrases appear in the summary section, exactly what boxes get checked when a federal employee starts talking about things that the institution does not have a comfortable framework for. The evaluation will say dissociative episode. It will say grief-induced perseveration. It will say occupational trauma with secondary delusional features. The official record will state that 5 rangers under my direct supervision died in an acute weather event on October 14th, that the loss destabilized me psychologically in ways that manifested as paranoid ideation, and that my subsequent behavior demonstrated a progressively deteriorating relationship with verifiable reality. That is the story the federal government has decided to keep on file. I am going to tell you what actually happened. The morning of October 14th started the way every morning in that sector started for 11 years. I was at the ranger station by 5:45 reviewing the overnight incident log and pulling up the satellite weather feed on the workstation in my office. There was a system moving in from the northwest, and the forecasts had it arriving no earlier than late afternoon. That gave my team a full operating window to complete their patrol rotations, return, debrief, and be sitting in the warmth of the station long before conditions deteriorated into anything serious. I had learned long ago not to make assumptions about mountain weather, but I had also learned to read the specific patterns of that sector well enough to distinguish between a real threat and a projection with a wide margin of error. That morning, the window was real. I would have bet my career on it. I had 5 rangers assigned to me that season. Cole had been with the service for 8 years, and had developed the kind of instincts for terrain that you cannot manufacture through training. He knew how snow moved on a slope the way a fisherman knows water, intuitively and completely, in ways that were difficult to articulate but consistently accurate. Lance was younger, 3 years in, but he was precise in the way that careful people are precise, methodical in his documentation, reliable in his communication, the kind of ranger whose radio reports were always exactly as long as they needed to be and never longer. Then there was Amber, who had transferred from a coastal park in Oregon the previous spring. She had an almost unsettling quality of calm in high-stress situations. The kind of calm that is not absence of feeling but rather a very practiced control of feeling that she had clearly spent a long time developing. There was Troy, 26 years old, who had grown up at elevation and moved through mountain terrain with a physical confidence that I have seen maybe twice in my entire career. He was not reckless. He was simply at home in a way that most people are not. And then there was Vera. Vera had been my most senior ranger. 12 years with the service. 6 of them in my sector. I trusted her judgment over almost anyone else in the region. She was quiet in the way that observant people are often quiet, absorbing more information in a sweep of a meadow than most rangers logged in a full written report. She covered for me when my father was sick and I needed to take emergency leave, doing it without being asked and without expecting anything in return. She was the person on that team I would have called if I had found myself in serious trouble on a trail alone. I want to be specific about that because I think it matters for understanding what it felt like to watch what I eventually watched. I deployed the team at 6:30. Cole and Lance went to the western ridgeline, covering the elevation from 8,000 to 11,000 feet. Amber and Troy took the eastern valley, where we had an outstanding report of unauthorized camping activity from the previous week that needed to be physically documented. Vera covered the central sector, which was the widest territory but also the most consistently navigable in terms of trail conditions. I told all 5 of them the same thing I told them every single morning, which was to check in at 10:30, to abort and return to the station immediately if conditions shifted, and to not take any risks that were not explicitly covered in the operational manual. They acknowledged. They always acknowledged. They went out into the trees and I went back into the station and did the administrative work that keeps a district operational. Paperwork, trail closure documentation, budget correspondence from the regional office that always felt slightly surreal given the actual landscape I was responsible for managing. At 10:25 I turned up the volume on the radio and waited for the check-in. 10:30 came, nothing. I told myself it was the terrain. We had dead zones throughout that sector. Pockets where the topography absorbed radio signals in ways that no engineer could fully account for in advance. Communication gaps happened. I had experienced them dozens of times over 11 years, and every single time the ranger had come back in, eventually with a plausible explanation involving a ravine or a particular ridge formation that had cut the signal. I waited 5 minutes. Then I tried the frequency myself. Nothing came back except the low hiss of an open channel with no one on it. At 10:36 the radio made a sound that I have spent 3 months trying to describe accurately, and I still do not think I have found the right language for it. It was not static in the conventional sense. It was not interference caused by weather or electromagnetic disruption, which I have heard plenty of and which has a specific recognizable quality. What came through the speaker was a layering of sounds that had a rhythm to them, almost like breathing, almost like structured language, but not quite either of those things. There were multiple tones underneath it that rose and fell in a pattern that felt deliberate. It lasted approximately 8 seconds, and then the channel went completely silent in a way that felt different from normal silence, in a way I am unable to explain technically but that I registered physically, as though something had been switched off rather than simply having stopped. I called out on 3 separate frequencies. I waited. I called again. Before I tell you what the search teams found out there, if this kind of story keeps you up at night the way it keeps me up, go ahead and hit subscribe and leave a comment below. It helps more than you know, and I want to keep telling these stories for as long as people are still willing to listen. Now, what they found in those mountains had no business being there. At 10:42 I initiated the emergency protocol and contacted search and rescue coordination. By 11:15, 2 teams were in the field, and a third was staging at the trailhead. By 1 in the afternoon, it was clear to everyone involved that the situation was not a communication malfunction. They found no bodies. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because I think the phrase gets processed too quickly when you read it. We are talking about 5 experienced rangers in a sector where I knew the terrain intimately, in weather conditions that had not yet turned severe, carrying full emergency gear including personal locator beacons, with established check-in protocols that had functioned reliably every single day of that season up to that moment. They did not wander off a trail. They did not succumb to sudden exposure. There were 5 human beings in those mountains, and when the search teams went looking for them, what they found were the things those people had left behind, arranged in ways that no emergency protocol and no weather event can account for. Cole's body camera was recovered hanging from a pine branch at approximately 9,000 feet elevation, suspended at eye level by a length of cord from his equipment pack, positioned with the lens facing straight down toward the ground. Someone had placed it there. Lance's radio was found half a mile away, set carefully on a flat rock beside his open pack. the contents of which had been removed and arranged on the ground in a straight line extending north. A water bottle, a folded emergency blanket, a protein bar, his compass, open and oriented, each item spaced approximately 12 inches from the next, the line extending for about 6 feet before ending. Troy's emergency beacon had been activated and then deactivated 3 times in a sequence that matched no distress signal in the operational manual. Amber's camera was standing upright in the snow at the edge of the Eastern Valley Trail with its recording light still active, and Vera's footprints in the snow, tracked by the search team from her last documented position, went in one direction for roughly 400 feet, then crossed themselves at angles that a person moving naturally cannot produce. The overlapping pattern covered an area approximately 40 feet across. The search team led, a man I had worked with for 9 years, called me on the radio after he had documented them and said nothing for almost 15 seconds before he spoke. He said he did not know how to write it up. Then the vehicles arrived. I need to tell you what happened in the hours before the unmarked vehicles showed up, because that is when I made the decision that changed everything that followed, and I want you to understand the reasoning behind it, or whatever passed for reasoning in that moment. When the first search team radioed back their position and began describing what they were finding, something shifted in me. It was not panic. Panic is loud and diffuse, and it scatters your focus. This was the opposite of that. Something went very quiet, and very narrow in my thinking. The way it does when a situation exceeds the available frameworks and you are forced back down to the most fundamental question, which is, what do I actually need to know right now? What I needed to know was what had happened to my people. The official process for answering that question was already underway and moving in a direction that I did not trust. Not because I had any specific evidence at that point, but because the specific quality of what the teams were finding did not match the template for any incident outcome I had encountered in 11 years of field work, and I had seen things in those mountains that most people would not believe even in the context of ordinary accidents. I drove out to Vera's last known position before the federal response arrived. I knew it was a procedural violation. I knew it compromised the scene documentation. I made the calculation that the cost of that violation was lower than the cost of not knowing, and I got out of the vehicle and walked to where her camera was sitting in the snow, and I took the memory card out of it and put it in the chest pocket of my jacket, against my sternum, and then I went back to the station. The men who came were not from any agency I had worked with in 11 years of federal employment, which covers a wider range of agencies than most people interact with in an entire career. They showed identification in a way that discouraged examination, the specific technique of people who are accustomed to authority being granted on presentation rather than verification. There were 4 of them. They were polite the way people are polite when the outcome of the interaction is not in question. They collected all of the recovered equipment, all of the cameras, all of the personal effects that had been brought in from the field. The conversation they had with me lasted approximately 20 minutes, and the only information it produced was that the investigation had been elevated to a federal level and that all personnel involved were to make no public statements. When I asked about body recovery, one of them, a man in his 40s with a flat, controlled affect and a posture that read as prior military, told me that recovery operations were ongoing and that I would be contacted. I never was. That night I sat in my truck in the station parking lot with my laptop open and Vera's memory card in the reader port, and I watched the footage for 4 hours. I watched it until my hands were shaking and my eyes were dry and burning, and I had to keep reminding myself to blink. The recording ran for 2 hours and 43 minutes before it cut out. The first hour and 22 minutes were exactly what they should have been. Vera walking the Central Sector Trail, narrating her observations in the steady, precise language she had used for 12 years of service. She noted the condition of the trail surface at 3 separate points. She documented a section of erosion near a creek crossing that would need to be flagged before the next significant rainfall. She made an observation about animal activity near a rock formation that she had been tracking across 3 consecutive patrol cycles. Her voice was professional and calm, and completely, unremarkably normal. At 1 hour and 22 minutes into the recording, she stopped walking. I have watched that section of footage more times than I can accurately count, and I still cannot identify what made her stop. The camera was at chest level, pointing down the trail ahead of her, and there was nothing visible in the frame except the trail surface and the trees on either side of it, and the gray-white sky above the canopy. She stopped. She stood there for 11 seconds. Then she very slowly turned her head to the right, toward the ridgeline, and she said, in a voice so quiet that I had to use headphones and push the volume to its maximum setting to make it out clearly, she said, I see you." Then she stood perfectly still for 6 more minutes. Then she began walking toward the ridge. What followed over the next hour and 21 minutes is the most disturbing thing I have ever watched, and I want to be very deliberate about how I describe it, because I am aware of the interpretive frameworks that are available to someone hearing this kind of account, and I want to be accurate rather than dramatic. There were no anomalous visual phenomena in that footage. There were no sounds that could not have come from the mountain environment. There were no entities that should not exist. What I saw was a person I had known and trusted for 6 years undergoing an acute and rapid psychological deterioration in real time, alone in a wilderness area, apparently in response to something I could not identify in the footage itself. She walked to a clearing, approximately a quarter mile from the main trail. The walk took 11 minutes. When she reached the tree line at the clearing's edge, she stopped again, and from the footage I could see that there were people in the clearing. I counted at least 8 of them, positioned at irregular intervals around the perimeter. They were at the outer range of what the camera could resolve clearly, and I could not identify any of them. They were wearing dark, heavy clothing appropriate to the temperature. None of them appeared to be moving. Vera walked to the center of the clearing and sat down in the snow. She sat there for 38 minutes. During that time, the figures at the perimeter did not visibly move. The camera was pointed at the tree line across the clearing, and I watched that tree line for 38 minutes without anything in it changing. Then Vera began to speak. The audio quality at that point was degraded, partly by distance from other sounds, and partly by what I believe was moisture in the microphone housing. I have spent many hours attempting to reconstruct a full transcription, and I can give you what I am confident about. She said that she had been carrying something for a long time that she had never had the right name for. She said she was choosing to put it down. She said it did not hurt the way she had always assumed it would. She said something about the weight of a name, which I have turned over in my mind 100 times without arriving at a satisfactory interpretation. Then she said clearly enough that I do not need headphones to hear it. She said the only thing we are afraid to lose is the part of ourselves we have not yet understood. At 2 hours and 41 minutes, she reached up and unclipped the camera from her vest with both hands, carefully and deliberately, the way you handle equipment you intend to preserve. She set it down in the snow with the lens facing the far tree line. Then she stood up, and she walked out of the frame, and the camera recorded the empty clearing and the motionless tree line for 2 minutes and 17 more seconds before the battery reached 0. I sat in my truck in that parking lot for a very long time after the footage ended. I did not have words for what I had watched. I still do not fully, but I knew 2 things with complete certainty. The first was that whatever had happened to Vera, and to the rest of my team, it was not a weather event. The second was that I was not going to let the official record stand unchallenged. Last week I went back to the mountain. I am going to tell you about that. And I am going to be as accurate as I can, because accuracy is the only thing I have left that feels like it matters. I drove up to the sector access road 3 days ago and parked at the trailhead at 4 in the morning. The air temperature was 23 degrees. I had my full cold weather gear, my personal locator beacon, a handheld recorder running in my jacket's inner pocket, and my own body camera clipped to my vest. I also had a printed copy of everything I had transcribed from Vera's footage, folded in my left chest pocket. Before I left the trailhead, I sent a text message to a contact I trust with the GPS coordinates of where I was going and instructions to contact the county sheriff if they had not heard from me by 9 in the morning. I am telling you about this preparation specifically because I want to be clear that I am not someone who walked into that situation without thinking it through. I have spent 11 years making risk assessments in wilderness environments. I made one that morning. I gave myself a 70% probability of finding nothing in the clearing, a 20% probability of finding evidence of ongoing unauthorized occupation of federal land which would give me something documentable to add to the report I had already filed with the county sheriff, and a 10% probability of something I was not able to fully define in advance, something that connected what I had watched on Vera's camera to something real and present and still active in those mountains. I started walking. The trail in pre-dawn darkness is a different experience from the trail in daylight, and I have made that walk many times, so I am not telling you this to communicate unfamiliarity. I am telling you because the particular quality of that darkness that morning had something in it that I did not fully understand until later. A density to it, a weight of silence that was more absolute than the silence I was accustomed to on early morning patrols. The stars were visible above the canopy in sections. My headlamp threw a cone of white light on the trail surface ahead of me, and I focused on that and I kept my pace consistent. At approximately 20 minutes into the walk, I heard a sound coming from the ridge to my left. It was a low sound, consistent in pitch, without the variation you associate with wind or animal movement. It had a regularity to it that my mind kept reaching toward and then failing to categorize. I stopped and stood still and listened for almost 2 minutes. The sound did not change in volume or character during that time. I noted it into the recorder and I kept walking. At 5:40 in the morning, I reached the tree line at the clearing's edge. There were 7 people in the clearing. Some of them were standing. 2 were seated in the snow. 1 was moving slowly along the outer boundary of the space in what I can only describe as a circuit, deliberate and measured, covering the same ground repeatedly without apparent purpose beyond the motion itself. None of them were looking toward me. None of them appeared to be in distress or danger. None of them were speaking that I could hear from the tree line. I pressed myself back against the nearest trunk, and I stood there and I watched for several minutes. The figure walking the perimeter continued at the same pace. The seated figures did not change position. The standing figures were oriented away from me, and I could not see their faces. I noted all of this into the recorder quietly and precisely: the date, the time, the count, the positions, the visible behavioral characteristics. Then one of the standing figures turned around. I want to describe what happened in my own perceptual system at that moment as carefully as I can, because I think it is the most significant part of what I have to tell you. And I think it is also the most easily misunderstood. When I saw that face across the clearing, approximately 60 feet away, in the gray pre-dawn light that was beginning to establish itself above the ridge to the east, my brain did what it always does when it encounters a face. It searched for a match. That is not a romantic or a spiritual description of what happened. That is a literal account of a neurological process that happens in all human beings. A rapid comparison of incoming visual data against stored templates in long-term memory. The face across the clearing matched a stored template in my memory with a specificity and a completeness that I was not prepared for. It matched my father. My father died 4 years ago at 67 years old. He died of a cardiac event in the kitchen of the house I grew up in the early morning hours of a Tuesday in November. And I was 200 miles away when it happened, and I did not make it there in time. I have thought about that regularly since then. The distance and the timing of it. The specific failure of presence at the specific moment when presence was most needed. The man standing in that clearing was not my father. I knew that. I want to be very clear that I knew that in the moment. My father is dead, and he is buried in a cemetery in a town in eastern Colorado, and I have stood at his grave. What I was looking at was a man of approximately the same age, the same build, with the same slight forward orientation of the head and shoulders that my father had always carried. The characteristic posture of someone who spent his life leaning toward the people he was talking to, because he wanted to make sure they understood that he was listening. The distance, the quality of the light, and the state of my own psychology after 3 months of inadequate sleep and chronic stress had produced a visual match strong enough to arrest my entire cognitive process for several seconds. I stood at the edge of those trees and I breathed deliberately, in for 4 counts and out for 4 counts. And I made myself work through what I was actually seeing. A group of individuals in an unauthorized gathering in a restricted federal area. One of them, at 60 feet in low light, resembling someone my memory held with exceptional clarity. No supernatural explanation required. No framework beyond the observable. Then the man who resembled my father took 2 slow steps toward me. I did not move. I did not call out. I kept my eyes on him and I kept breathing and I let the recorder in my pocket keep running. He stopped at the 2 steps. He stood there looking toward the tree line where I was standing, and the expression on his face, even at that distance, communicated something that I felt in a very specific way that I am still processing. It was not threat. It was not aggression. It was a kind of waiting that seemed to predate the specific situation entirely, as though whatever state he was holding had been in place long before I arrived and would be in place long after I left, and my arrival was simply one variable in a field of many variables he had already accounted for. I said the date and time, and a description of what I was seeing into the recorder. I said it quietly, and I said it clearly, and I said that I was withdrawing to the trailhead and would be contacting the county sheriff on my return. Then I turned around and I began walking back through the trees. 35 minutes later, I was at the truck. I did not run. Running in those conditions in that terrain is how injuries happen, and injuries in that location at that hour with no one else around is how situations become catastrophic. I walked at the fastest pace I could manage safely, and I narrated continuously into the recorder, and I did not hear anything behind me during that walk that gave me reason to increase my pace. The low sound from the ridge was gone after the first 10 minutes. By the time the trailhead was visible through the trees, I could hear only the wind moving through the upper branches, and my own breathing, and the sound of my boots on the packed snow of the trail. I sat in the truck for a long time before I turned the key. I am home now. The recording is backed up in 3 places: Vera's memory card, and the transcriptions are in a fireproof storage case that a friend is holding for me. I have submitted a formal report to the county sheriff documenting the presence of unauthorized individuals in the restricted sector with GPS coordinates and a timestamp. I have also submitted a summary of everything I observed to a contact at a regional news organization who has agreed to review it. I do not know whether any of that will produce a meaningful outcome. I know that it exists independently of me now, which means that describing me as unstable does not make it go away. I do not know who those people in the clearing are. I do not know what they were doing there across multiple months in a restricted federal wilderness area, or how they have managed to sustain a presence in those conditions, or what connection they have to the disappearance of my 5 rangers. I do not know what Vera saw when she turned her head toward the ridge and said, "I see you." I do not know what she meant when she said she was putting something down and it did not hurt the way she had expected it to. I do not know why 5 experienced, committed, healthy people walked away from their equipment and their lives and their identities in a single morning in October and have not been seen or heard from since. What I know is that it is real. Every documented piece of it is real and preserved, and in more than one location. And I know that the man in the clearing, before I turned and began my walk back through the trees, raised his right hand, not aggressively, not as a signal, just a simple, quiet raising of the hand at about shoulder height, the way you acknowledge someone you recognize from across a room, the way you say, without needing to say it, "I see you." The same 4 words Vera spoke alone on a trail at 9,000 feet before she walked toward a ridge and did not come back. The coffee on my table is cold again. The recorder is on the desk next to the camera with a fresh charge. When the sun comes up, I am going to keep working, because whatever is happening in those mountains is not finished, and I am not willing to be the person who accepts the version of events that requires my team's disappearance to be a footnote in a weather report. They were real people. They had names. They had 12 years of service, and 8 years of service, and 3 years, and a lifetime of knowing how to move through altitude, and a kind of calm that I have spent 3 months missing every single day. The camera is charged. The recorder has batteries. And I am still here, which matters more than I can say. It was early September of 2013 when the idea first surfaced during one of our rare phone calls. A camping trip, just like old times. I hadn't seen Jason or Cole in nearly 18 months by then. Life had scattered us after college like leaves in autumn wind. I was buried under 60-hour work weeks at a marketing firm in Vermont. Jason had taken a job with a shipping company in New Hampshire. Cole bounced between construction sites and temporary apartments, never quite settling anywhere. "Remember Whispering Ridge?" Jason asked during our call, his voice crackling with poor reception. The name alone made my stomach tighten. I remembered it too well. We'd camped there once during our sophomore year of college. It wasn't an official campsite, just an unmarked clearing about 3 hours deep into the state forest. No designated trail led there, no rangers patrolled it. You had to climb over a steep natural ledge to reach it, hence our nickname for the place. We'd discovered it by accident during a hike 5 years earlier. The spot had everything: a flat clearing perfect for tents, a small stream nearby, and someone had already arranged rocks into a fire ring. Most importantly, it offered complete isolation. No cell service, no other hikers, nothing but wilderness stretching for miles. "What about it?" I asked, although I already knew where this conversation was heading. "We should go back," Cole interjected. "One last trip before winter hits." I hesitated. Something about that place had always felt wrong to me, even during our first visit when nothing unusual happened. But nostalgia is a powerful drug, and the thought of escaping my cubicle for a weekend tempted me beyond reason. "Just 3 days," Jason pressed. "Friday through Sunday, like the old days." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We settled on the 3rd weekend of September. I requested time off work, Jason arranged for coverage at his job, and Cole never needed permission from anyone. We coordinated supplies through a group text: sleeping bags, food, water purification tablets, first aid kit, headlamps, boots. I volunteered to bring the tent, a 4-person weatherproof model I'd purchased for a trip that never materialized. Jason would handle food, mostly dehydrated meals and energy bars. Cole promised firewood and alcohol. As the day approached, I found myself checking the weather obsessively. The forecast showed clear skies, but I packed extra tarps anyway. Something about returning to Whispering Ridge made me anxious in ways I couldn't articulate. I told myself it was just pre-trip jitters. The night before our departure, I dreamt of trees with eyes. Not eyes embedded in bark, but watching from between branches. I woke at 3:17 a.m., drenched in sweat despite the autumn chill. My apartment felt too empty, too quiet. I lay awake until dawn, listening to the occasional car passing on the street below, wondering if I should cancel. I didn't. Some decisions we make knowing they're mistakes, yet we make them anyway. We met at a diner just outside the forest entrance, arriving in separate vehicles. Jason looked thinner than I remembered, his once athletic frame now wiry and tense. Cole hadn't changed much, still broad-shouldered and sporting that perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. We ate quickly, reviewing our route over coffee and maps. The turnoff is unmarked, Jason explained, tracing a finger along a faded hiking trail. We'll park at the main lot, then hike about 40 minutes to this creek. From there, we head east through this section of pines until we hit the ridge. Cole nodded, mouth full of pancakes. And we're sure we can still find it? I've been back once, Jason admitted, surprising both of us. About 2 years ago. It's still there. I wanted to ask why he'd gone back alone, but something in his expression stopped me. We drove to the trailhead in convoy, my car following Jason's old Honda, Cole riding shotgun with him. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a ranger's truck and a couple with hiking poles preparing for a day trip. We shouldered our packs, checked our supplies one last time, and headed into the forest. The main trail was well maintained for the first mile, but as we veered east onto the unmarked path Jason remembered, the terrain grew challenging. Fallen trees blocked our way multiple times. The forest floor was spongy with decades of decomposing leaves. Overhead branches formed a canopy so dense that by mid-afternoon it seemed like dusk was already settling. "It's colder than I expected," Cole said, zipping his jacket higher. He was right. Despite the forecast promising mid-60s, the temperature in the forest couldn't have been above 50. Our breath formed clouds in front of our faces. The air smelled sharp with pine and something else. Something metallic, like the scent of pennies in your palm. "We should be close," Jason murmured, pausing to consult his compass. "The ridge should be just ahead." We pushed through a thick stand of pines, branches scraping our arms and faces, and suddenly there it was, the ledge. A natural stone formation that rose about 15 feet, creating a wall we'd need to climb to reach our destination. "Just like I remembered." Cole grinned, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. We climbed single file, finding the same handholds and footholds we'd used years before. At the top, we helped each other over the final lip of rock, then stood for a moment, catching our breath and looking down at the clearing below. Whispering. Ridge hadn't changed. The fire pit remained, stones blackened from countless flames. The clearing was perhaps 30 feet in diameter, surrounded by dense forest on all sides except for the ledge we'd just climbed. The stream trickled nearby, barely audible over the constant hushing of wind through pines. "Home sweet home," Jason said, dropping his pack. We made camp efficiently, working with the practiced coordination of people who'd done this together before. The tent went up near the center of the clearing. We gathered additional stones to reinforce the fire ring. Cole arranged his pre-cut logs in a neat stack nearby. I unpacked the small camp stove and cooking gear. By the time darkness fell, we had a fire crackling, 3 camping chairs arranged around it, and our sleeping bags ready inside the tent. I heated water for our dehydrated meals, while Jason produced a bottle of whiskey from his pack. "Two old friends," he toasted, passing the bottle. The whiskey burned going down, but it pushed back against the unusual cold. We ate our reconstituted pasta, reminisced about college days, and avoided talking about our current lives. The fire cast long shadows that danced at the edges of the clearing. Occasionally, one of us would glance into the darkness beyond our campsite, then quickly return to the conversation. "Remember when we used to think we'd change the world?" Cole laughed, but there was something bitter in his voice. Jason nodded. "Still might. There's time." "Is there?" I asked, not sure why the question surfaced. The conversation lulled. The fire popped and hissed. Somewhere deep in the forest, a branch snapped. "Did you guys hear that?" Cole asked. We all pretended we hadn't. I woke before dawn, disoriented. The interior of the tent was pitch black and freezing cold. My watch read 5:22 a.m. Beside me, Jason slept facing away, his breathing deep and regular. Cole's sleeping bag was empty. Needing to relieve myself, I unzipped the tent as quietly as possible and stepped outside. The fire had died completely. Not even embers remained. A thick mist hung just above the ground, transforming the clearing into something from another time. The air smelled wrong. Not the expected forest scents of pine and earth, but something stagnant, like standing water in an abandoned basement. I found Cole sitting on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, staring into the forest. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, approaching slowly. He didn't turn. "Something's watching us." I followed his gaze but saw nothing except trees and mist. Probably just deer or something. Not deer. His voice was flat. I heard it moving around the tent all night, circling, breathing. A shiver ran across my shoulders that had nothing to do with the cold. "You want some coffee? I can get the stove going." Cole finally looked at me, and I was struck by how exhausted he appeared. Eyes sunken, skin ashen. "Did you notice the stream?" "What about it?" "It's running backward." I laughed nervously. "That's not possible." Cole stood up. "See for yourself." I followed him to the stream, more to humor him than anything else. The water looked darker than it should, almost black in the weak pre-dawn light. I crouched down, watching leaves and twigs drift by. Cole was wrong. The stream flowed in the normal direction. But as I watched, I noticed something odd about the water itself. It seemed to move too slowly, as if slightly more viscous than water should be. "It's just water," I said, standing up. Cole shook his head. "It changed when you came. It knows we're watching now." I was about to respond when Jason called from the tent. "What are you guys doing?" "Just getting some air," I called back, grateful for the interruption. "I'm going to start coffee." The day improved with sunlight and caffeine. Cole became more like himself, laughing at Jason's jokes and helping prepare breakfast. By mid-morning, the incident seemed forgotten. We decided to explore the surrounding area, partly for something to do and partly to gather more firewood. We hiked along the ridge following the stream upstream. The forest grew denser, the trees older and taller. Nearly an hour into our walk, we noticed the first anomaly, a perfect circle of mushrooms surrounding a bare patch of earth. Not unusual in forests, but these mushrooms were a vibrant red with white spots that none of us recognized. "Don't touch those," Jason warned. "They look poisonous." 20 minutes later, we found the structure. It appeared suddenly through a break in the trees, a crude shelter made of weathered plywood nailed to living trunks, with a tattered tarp stretched across for a roof. It might have been a hunter's blind at first glance, but the position made no sense for hunting. It faced a solid rock wall with no game trail nearby. "Someone lived here," Cole murmured, approaching cautiously. He was right. Inside the small space, we found remnants of human habitation. A rusted can opener, a metal cup crusted with something brown, a rotting backpack. "Check this out," Jason called from behind the shelter. We joined him to find what appeared to be an arrangement of animal bones. not scattered randomly, but carefully placed in complex patterns. Small mammal skulls, raccoons, possums, maybe a fox, formed the center of the design. Larger bones radiated outward in spiral patterns. "What the hell is this?" I whispered. "Someone's art project," Jason suggested, but didn't sound convinced. Cole crouched down, examining the pattern without touching it. "These aren't all animal bones." A heavy silence fell over us. Jason broke it first. "We should head back." None of us argued. The return journey took longer than it should have. Twice we found ourselves walking in circles despite following what should have been a straight path along the ridge. The third time we emerged at an unfamiliar clearing, Cole lost his temper. "This is impossible. The stream is right there. We just need to follow it downhill." "Let's try again," I suggested, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "We just need to stay together and pay better attention." It was nearly dusk by the time we found our campsite again. Jason immediately set about building a fire while I prepared our dinner. Cole sat on a log staring into the forest, unusually quiet. That night, none of us suggested exploring any further. We kept the fire burning higher than necessary and finished Jason's whiskey. The conversation was stilted, full of long pauses and unfinished thoughts. When we finally retreated to the tent, it was with unspoken relief. "Tomorrow we head out early," Jason said as we settled into our sleeping bags. "First light." Cole and I murmured agreement. Despite the exhaustion of our day, sleep came reluctantly. I drifted off listening to the forest sounds, wind through branches, occasional animal calls, and something else that might have been footsteps circling our tent, too rhythmic to be random, too deliberate to be wildlife. The scream woke me, a sound so primal and terrified that I was on my feet before my mind fully registered what I'd heard. The tent was empty, except for me. My watch read 3:17 a.m., the same time I'd awakened in my apartment before the trip. "Jason? Cole?" I called, fumbling for my headlamp. Outside, the clearing was transformed. A dense fog had settled, so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead. The fire had died completely. There was no sign of either of my friends, but their boots remained neatly placed outside the tent. "Jason!" I shouted, louder this time. "Cole!" Something moved in the fog, a shadow, quick and low to the ground. I spun toward it, heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing there. My headlamp cut weak paths through the mist as I circled the campsite, calling my friends' names with increasing desperation. No response came except the distant rustling of leaves. Both their sleeping bags were empty, but their phones and wallets remained in the tent. Who leaves without shoes, phone, or wallet? At the edge of the clearing, I found the first clue: Jason's sweatshirt lying on the ground, one sleeve stretched as if pulled forcefully. 10 yards further into the forest, I found his t-shirt. Then his watch. Each item formed a perfect breadcrumb trail leading deeper into the woods. I followed, aware that I was making a terrible mistake but unable to abandon my friends. The fog seemed to part just enough to reveal the next item, then close behind me as I passed. A quarter-mile in, the trail split. Jason's jeans lay to the left while Cole's hoodie appeared on a path to the right. I stood paralyzed by indecision until I heard it. A whisper that might have been my name coming from the left fork. I turned my headlamp in that direction and saw movement. A figure ducking behind a tree. "Jason?" I called, voice cracking. The figure stepped partially into view. The right height and build for Jason, but somehow wrong. Movements too fluid, posture too straight. Before I could process what I was seeing, my headlamp flickered and died. Total darkness enveloped me. Not the darkness of a night in the woods with ambient starlight, but absolute impenetrable blackness. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, finding it dead despite being fully charged when we'd gone to sleep. Something rustled in the underbrush nearby. Not one set of footsteps, but many, moving in perfect synchronization. They circled me slowly, maintaining distance but clearly aware of my position. I remained frozen, afraid that movement would trigger whatever was out there. A sound reached my ears. Breathing, heavy and wet, like someone with fluid in their lungs. It came from directly behind me. I felt warm air on the back of my neck. I ran, blind, terrified, with no sense of direction. Branches whipped my face and arms. I tripped over roots and stones, falling repeatedly only to scramble back up and continue fleeing. Behind me, something pursued. Something heavy that crashed through underbrush without concern for stealth. After what felt like hours but was probably minutes, I burst through the trees and found myself back at the ledge, our entry point to the campsite. Morning light had begun to filter through the canopy. I turned, expecting to see my pursuer, but the forest behind me was still and empty. I waited at the ledge until full daylight, calling for my friends until my voice gave out. Neither appeared. With trembling hands, I climbed down the rock face and hiked back to the parking lot, half expecting to find their vehicles gone. They weren't. Both cars sat exactly where we'd left them, locked and undisturbed. I drove to the nearest ranger station, incoherently reporting my missing friends. The rangers were professional but skeptical, especially when I couldn't precisely mark our campsite on their maps. They noted that no official campground existed in that area of the forest. "We'll send out a search team," the head ranger assured me. "But if your friends separated from you, they might have already hiked out to another exit point." I knew better but couldn't explain why. The search found nothing. No tent, no campsite, no belongings, no sign that 3 people had spent 2 nights in the forest. No bones arranged in spirals, no crude shelter. Nothing but endless trees and silence. 2 weeks after returning from Whispering Ridge, I received the first letter. No return address, postmarked from a small town in Pennsylvania I'd never heard of. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph showing our campsite from an angle that suggested it had been taken from the surrounding trees. Jason, Cole, and I sat around the fire. Our faces turned slightly away from the camera as if we'd heard something in the forest. I didn't remember anyone taking pictures during our trip. None of us had brought a Polaroid camera. I studied the image for hours, noticing details that made my skin crawl. In the background, barely visible between 2 distant trees, stood a figure. Too tall, too thin, its proportions subtly wrong, and our expressions in the photo weren't casual or relaxed. We looked terrified, frozen in the moment before flight. The second letter arrived a month later, this time from Oregon. Another Polaroid. The 3 of us asleep in the tent, photographed through the mesh window. The tent flap was open wider than we'd left it that night. Someone, something, had stood over us while we slept. I called the detective assigned to the missing persons case repeatedly, but interest had waned when no evidence surfaced. "People go missing in national forests all the time," he explained with rehearsed patience. "Usually they've chosen to disappear." I knew Jason wouldn't abandon his elderly mother who depended on his support. Cole wouldn't leave behind the construction job he'd finally secured after months of searching. But without evidence, the case stalled. The final letter arrived exactly 3 months after our trip. Postmarked from my own city, which terrified me more than its contents. A third Polaroid showing the crude shelter we'd discovered, but transformed. The plywood walls now displayed hundreds of photographs pinned to the surface. Even in the grainy image, I recognized myself in many of them. Entering my apartment building, sitting at my desk by the window, sleeping in my bed. I'd been watched for months, maybe longer. That night, I heard it for the first time. The same wet, labored breathing I'd heard in the forest, now outside my bedroom window on the 4th floor of my apartment building. When I gathered the courage to look outside, I saw nothing but empty streets and streetlights casting yellow pools on wet pavement. But something had left muddy footprints on the fire escape. Prints too large to be human, with toes too long and articulated like fingers. I didn't sleep that night, or many nights after. I installed additional locks, security cameras, motion detector lights. None of it helped the growing certainty that whatever had taken my friends had followed me home. 5 months after our camping trip, Cole's sister called me. Her voice trembled with a mixture of hope and dread. I got a text from Cole's phone, she said. First one since he disappeared. My grip tightened on my own phone. What did it say? Just coordinates. GPS coordinates in one word. Help. I knew before she told me. The coordinates would lead back to Whispering Ridge. When she confirmed this, something inside me shattered. The fragile normalcy I'd constructed since returning from the forest collapsed like a house of cards. I'm going to send them to the police, she continued. They won't find anything, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. I need those coordinates. Why? You can't be thinking of going back there. I didn't answer her question directly. Did you tell anyone else about the text? No, just you. A pause. You know something you're not telling me. It's better if you don't know, I replied. Send me the exact coordinates, then delete the message and forget you received it. She argued, of course, threatened to call the police herself if I didn't explain. Eventually, I told her a sanitized version of what had happened, that we'd become lost, separated in the forest, that I believed Jason and Cole might have found shelter somewhere remote with limited phone service. I promised to take experienced guides, emergency supplies, proper communication equipment. All lies. The coordinates arrived in my email an hour later, along with a message. Find my brother. I spent the next week preparing, not with camping gear and hiking supplies, but with different tools altogether. A handheld GPS unit, a night vision monocular I purchased from a hunting supply store, a digital recorder, and my father's revolver, taken from the safe where it had remained since his death 3 years earlier. I had never fired it, but I watched enough YouTube videos to understand the basics. I told no one where I was going. I called in sick to work, citing a family emergency. I left no note, made no arrangements for my absence. Part of me already knew I might not return. The forest looked different in winter. Skeletal trees, patches of snow in shaded areas, the undergrowth withered and brown. I reached the trailhead at noon, parked in the now empty lot, and began the hike with single-minded determination. The GPS unit led me unerringly toward the coordinates from Cole's text, which aligned almost perfectly with my memory of our campsite. The forest was silent, except for the crunch of dead leaves and occasional twigs beneath my boots. No birds called. No squirrels darted through branches. The absence of wildlife registered as wrong on a primal level. A warning sign my body recognized before my conscious mind. I reached the ledge by mid-afternoon. The climb was more difficult than I remembered, the hand and footholds slick with ice in places. At the top, I stood staring down at the clearing where we had camped. It remained recognizable but transformed. The fire ring was gone, replaced by a perfect circle of bare earth surrounded by evenly spaced stones. Our tent was still there, collapsed and partially rotted. Its once bright fabric faded to a sickly gray. Most disturbing were the markings carved into surrounding trees. Not random vandalism, but precise geometric patterns. Circles containing smaller circles. Triangles with extra angles. Eyes that weren't quite eyes. I checked the GPS coordinates again. This was exactly where Cole's text had originated. "Cole?" I called, my voice sounding thin and frail in the winter air. "Jason?" Something moved at the edge of my vision, just a shadow slipping between distant trees. I turned toward it, hand moving instinctively to the revolver in my coat pocket. "Who's there?" I demanded. A figure stepped partially into view, remaining half hidden behind a massive pine. The right height and build to be Cole, but something in my gut screamed that it wasn't him. Not entirely, not anymore. "You came back," said a voice that approximated Cole's but lacked its warmth and rhythm. It sounded hollow, like someone speaking through a long tube. "Where's Jason?" I asked, drawing the revolver but keeping it pointed at the ground. The figure tilted its head at an uncomfortable angle. "With us. Where he belongs. Where you belong. Show yourself properly," I demanded, Step out where I can see you. You don't want that. Not Cole replied. You think you do, but you don't. Some things can't be unseen. I raised the gun, aiming at the portion of the figure visible beyond the tree. I'm not playing games. Where are my friends? The figure sighed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. They're here. They're everywhere here. Parts of them anyway. We needed parts. A wave of nausea hit me. What does that mean? What did you do to them? Not me. Us. We've been here long before your kind named these woods. We sleep. We wake. We hunger. The figure shifted slightly. But you know that already. You felt us watching. You heard us breathing. You sensed us even before you came here the first time. It was right. Even during our first college trip years ago, I'd felt something wrong about this place. A presence that pressed against my consciousness like hands on a window pane, trying to find a way in. What are you? I whispered. Hungry, it replied simply. And you brought something we need. I tightened my grip on the revolver. I didn't bring anything. Not in your pockets, not in your pack, in your head. Memories, connections, the map of everyone you've ever known or loved, the location of every soul that would come looking if you vanished. Not Cole stepped fully into view, and I felt my sanity slip a notch. It wore Cole's face like an ill-fitting mask. The proportions were wrong. Eyes too wide and flat, mouth stretched too broadly across features that seemed to shift subtly even as I watched. The body beneath his familiar flannel shirt was wrong too. Too angular, joints bending in directions human anatomy wouldn't allow. You're not Cole. I stated the obvious, trying to ground myself. Parts of me are, it replied. The parts we needed. The rest is something older. I raised the gun higher. Stay back. It smiled, revealing teeth that hadn't been visible before. Too many, too sharp. We've been patient. We let you leave last time because we weren't finished with the others. But now we are. Now it's your turn. I fired the revolver. The sound was deafening in the winter stillness. The thing wearing Cole's face jerked backward but didn't fall. Where the bullet struck its shoulder, the flannel shirt tore open to reveal not blood and tissue, but something dark and fibrous, like wet wood. It looked down at the wound with mild curiosity. That won't work here. Nothing from your world works here the way you think it should. From the surrounding forest came sounds of movement, branches snapping, undergrowth rustling, not from one direction, but from all around, closing in. I fired again, this time aiming for what passed as its head. The bullet struck true, and for a moment, the thing's form destabilized. Flickering like a bad television signal, Cole's features dissolving into something I couldn't comprehend. Then it reformed, the wound already sealing itself. You should run now, it suggested almost kindly. We enjoy the chase. Your friends did too for a while. I ran. I fled not toward the ledge and escape, but deeper into the forest, toward the coordinates from Cole's text. Something in me knew that running toward safety was exactly what they expected, what they wanted. The chase was part of their ritual, their feeding pattern. So I ran toward danger instead, hoping to disrupt whatever plan they had in motion. The forest changed as I moved deeper, trees growing closer together, their bark blackened as if by fire, though no fire had been reported in this region for decades. The ground beneath my feet transitioned from frozen soil to something spongier, almost membranous. I tried not to think about what I might be running across. Behind me, the pursuit continued. Multiple entities moving through the forest with unnatural speed and coordination. They made no attempt at stealth now, crashing through undergrowth and calling to each other with sounds no human throat could produce. My lungs burned. My legs threatened to buckle. But terror drove me forward, deeper into the heart of whatever aberration had claimed this section of forest. I reached the exact coordinates from Cole's message as the last daylight faded. What I found there defied explanation. A perfect clearing that couldn't have formed naturally. Trees surrounded it in a geometrically precise circle. At the center stood the crude shelter we'd discovered months ago, but transformed. It had grown. The original plywood structure now formed just one wall of a larger construction that incorporated living trees, their trunks bent and fused into impossible shapes to create a cathedral-like space beneath. The tarp roof had been replaced with a canopy of interwoven branches that pulsed slightly, as if respiring. Most disturbing were the photographs. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, covering every surface. Polaroids, digital prints, ancient sepia-toned images, all showing people in this forest. Some dated back decades based on the clothing styles. Some were recent enough to show modern hiking gear. In many, the subjects looked directly at the camera, expressions ranging from confusion to terror. And moving among these images were shapes, not quite human, not quite animal, that seemed to shift and blur when viewed directly. They tended the photographs like gardeners caring for plants, occasionally removing one from the wall and carrying it deeper into the structure. I crouched behind a fallen log, watching this incomprehensible scene unfold. My pursuers had fallen silent, but I knew they were still coming. This place, this structure, was clearly their destination, their home. As my eyes adjusted to the growing darkness, I noticed something at the center of the shelter, a device that seemed jarringly out of place in this organic nightmare. A camera. Not digital, but an old Polaroid, mounted on what might have been a tripod fashioned from bone and sinew. Beside it lay a pile of objects I recognized with growing horror. Jason's watch, Cole's pocket knife, my own lost hat that had disappeared during our trip. Personal items taken from dozens, perhaps hundreds of victims, over who knows how many years. I understood then, in a moment of clarity that felt like breaking through ice into freezing water. They didn't just take people, they collected them, preserved them somehow in these endless photographs. The camera wasn't just a tool. It was the center of whatever ritual they performed. My revolver had 3 bullets remaining. Not enough to fight whatever these entities were, but perhaps enough for what I needed to do. I waited until the shambling figures moved to the far side of the clearing, then sprinted toward the center of the shelter. The ground beneath my feet felt warm and yielding, like flesh rather than soil. I reached the camera, aimed my revolver at it point blank, and fired twice. The Polaroid exploded in a spray of plastic, metal, and something dark that might have been blood. A scream tore through the forest. Not from any single entity, but from the forest itself. The trees shuddered. The ground convulsed. Photographs began falling from the walls, their images melting and running like wax. The figures turned toward me, their forms fluctuating wildly between human appearance and something else. Something with too many limbs, too many eyes, proportions that violated the laws of geometry. I fired my final bullet into the pile of personal effects, hitting something that sparked and caught fire. The flames spread unnaturally fast, engulfing the center of the shelter in seconds. As the fire grew, the entities became more substantial, more visible, as if the flames revealed their true nature. What I saw in that firelight broke something in my mind. They had never been human, never been animals. They were something else entirely. Ancient intelligences that had learned to mimic life forms but never quite mastered the subtleties. The largest of them lurched toward me, its form settling briefly into a grotesque approximation of Cole. Beneath the familiar features, I glimpsed something vast and incomprehensible. A consciousness that had existed in these woods long before humans arrived, feeding on fear and memory and identity. "You cannot unmake us," it said in Cole's voice. "We are bound to this place." "I don't need to unmake you," I replied, backing toward the edge of the clearing. "I just need people to know you exist." From my pocket, I pulled my phone, not dead as I'd led them to believe, but recording everything since I'd entered the clearing. I'd live-streamed the entire encounter to a private server, insurance in case I didn't make it out. The creature wearing Cole's face recoiled as if physically struck. "Others have tried to expose us. Their evidence never survives." "Technology changes," I said. "You don't." With that, I turned and ran for the ledge, for escape, for whatever normal life might remain possible after what I'd witnessed. Behind me, the fire continued spreading, consuming the unnatural structure and the thousands of photographs it contained. I never looked back. I didn't need to. I could feel them pursuing. Their rage, their hunger, their ancient confusion at being exposed to the modern world. But they didn't catch me. Perhaps they couldn't leave their territory. Perhaps the fire weakened them. Perhaps my knowledge of their existence gave me some power they couldn't overcome. I reached my car just as full darkness descended, drove straight to the nearest town, and collapsed in a motel room. The live stream had worked, grainy, dark, but clear enough to show the structure, the photographs, the fire. Not clear enough to show the creatures in detail, which was perhaps a mercy. That was 2 years ago. I've moved 4 times since then, changing my name, my appearance, my entire life. The footage I captured went viral briefly before being dismissed as an elaborate hoax. Experts pointed out the impossibilities in the structure I'd filmed, the way physics seemed to work differently in that clearing. Some suggested advanced CGI. Others claimed I'd used actors and practical effects. Only a few believed, mostly families of those who had disappeared in those woods over the decades. They recognized items belonging to their loved ones in my footage. They contacted me, shared stories of similar experiences, of photographs arriving from impossible locations, of being watched by something that moved just at the edge of vision. The official investigation found nothing. Rangers and police searched the area I identified, but discovered no shelter, no scorched clearing, no evidence of the massive fire I described. The forest appeared untouched, primeval. They labeled my story a hoax, possibly motivated by guilt over abandoning my friends during a camping trip gone wrong. Jason and Cole remain officially missing. Their families have given up hope for their return. Sometimes I dream of them. Not as they were, but as they became. Parts of them incorporated into something older and hungrier than humanity was ever meant to encounter. I keep moving because sometimes I still hear that wet, labored breathing outside my window at night. Sometimes I find photographs in my mailbox, images of me sleeping, eating, working, with no postmark or return address. Sometimes my phone captures strange distortions in the background of selfies, tall, thin figures with proportions that shouldn't exist. I've stopped deleting these images. Instead, I collect them, studying them for patterns or meanings I might have missed. The entities in the forest collected photographs as a way of collecting people. Their memories, their connections, perhaps even their souls. I don't know if my live stream weakened them or merely angered them. I don't know if burning their collection released their victims or simply destroyed evidence of their existence. What I do know is this: the forest is still there. Whispering Ridge still waits for hikers to stumble across its unnatural clearing. And whatever hungers there is patient, ancient enough to wait decades for revenge, intelligent enough to adapt its methods to a changing world. So I keep moving, keep watching. I've installed cameras in every corner of my current apartment. I sleep with a weapon within reach. I avoid forests entirely. And if you're reading this, consider it a warning. If you're ever hiking and find a clearing that seems too perfect, a campsite with a fire ring already prepared, or a ledge that must be climbed to reach an isolated spot, turn back. Some parts of our world were never meant for human habitation. Some entities we were never meant to encounter. They're still hungry. They're still collecting. And sometimes, on nights when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear them breathing, just outside my door, waiting for me to let down my guard. God help me, sometimes I almost want to. In late autumn of 2019, I was working as a package delivery driver for a shipping company in rural Tennessee. At 29, I'd been with the company for just over 3 years, long enough to know the rhythm of the job, but still new enough to be assigned the routes nobody else wanted. Most days, I navigated a hulking box truck through winding mountain roads and forgotten backwoods communities, where addresses were suggestions rather than certainties. The company had assigned me what they called extended rural routes, which was corporate speak for the most isolated, difficult-to-reach customers in the county. My daily run took me through dense forests and along unmarked dirt roads that disappeared into thick underbrush. The truck's GPS often gave up entirely, leaving me to rely on paper maps and vague directions from locals. You'll know it when you see the 3 mailboxes clustered together. Then take a right at the oak with the lightning scar, an old-timer had once told me at a gas station. Somehow, these imprecise landmarks always proved more reliable than any digital technology. I actually enjoyed the solitude of these routes most days. The hills were peaceful in the mornings, fog drifting between pine trees like ghosts, deer watching curiously as my truck rumbled past. The residents were typically friendly, country people who appreciated someone bringing their orders from the outside world. They'd offer coffee, share local gossip, or warn me about washed-out roads ahead. But not all stops were pleasant. Some properties sent warning signals the moment you turned onto their drives. Aggressive no trespassing signs riddled with bullet holes, Confederate flags hanging limp in the still air, or the eerie silence that falls when you realize you're being watched but can't spot the observer. I developed a system for these places: park facing the exit, leave the keys in the ignition, make the delivery quick, and never venture beyond what was absolutely necessary. Rural delivery taught me to trust my instincts. When something felt wrong, it usually was. October had brought shorter days and earlier sunsets. By 4 in the afternoon, shadows lengthened across the landscape, transforming familiar terrain into something more sinister. The company had a policy against deliveries after dark in these remote areas, but the reality of the job meant I was often racing the setting sun to complete my route. That particular day had started normally enough. I'd loaded my truck before dawn, checked my manifest, and headed out as the first hints of sunrise colored the eastern sky. The weather had turned unseasonably cold, and a thin layer of frost covered the ground. My breath formed small clouds in the cab as I worked through my morning deliveries. Nothing about that day suggested it would permanently alter how I viewed my job, my safety, or my understanding of what people are capable of hiding in plain sight. By early afternoon, I had worked through 2/3 of my packages. The remaining deliveries took me deeper into the county, beyond cell service and into areas where houses appeared only occasionally through breaks in the dense forest. The roads narrowed, pavement giving way to gravel, then to rutted dirt paths barely wide enough for my truck. My next drop-off was marked on my manifest simply as 6708 Timber Ridge Road. The address had a note attached: "End of road, no house number visible." This wasn't unusual for rural deliveries, but something about this particular note made me pause. I'd been down Timber Ridge Road before, delivering to houses near its entrance, but never to its end. The turn onto Timber Ridge appeared suddenly. A gap in the trees with a weather-beaten wooden sign nailed to a pine trunk. The road immediately declined into a steep, winding path. Loose gravel shifted under my tires as I navigated the descent. Tall trees crowded both sides, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out much of the afternoon light. I passed several mailboxes clustered at the road's entrance. The occupied properties were always closer to the main road, I'd learned. As I continued deeper, the houses grew more sporadic, more weathered. Most appeared uninhabited, with boarded windows or collapsing roofs. The few occupied homes showed minimal signs of life. A thread of smoke from a chimney, a single vehicle parked outside, yards maintained just enough to keep the forest at bay. 3 miles down Timber Ridge, the houses stopped entirely. I checked my GPS out of habit, though I knew it wouldn't help. The screen showed me traveling through an empty green space, no roads marked. According to my manifest, I should be getting close. The road narrowed further, forcing me to drive at walking speed to avoid the worst ruts and exposed roots that threatened to bottom out my truck. Tree branches scraped against the sides of my vehicle like fingernails. I instinctively hunched lower in my seat. After another mile of painstaking progress, the road forked unexpectedly. No markers indicated which direction to take. I consulted my manifest again, finding no additional information. With reluctance, I chose the right fork, which seemed slightly more traveled than the left. The path grew even worse. Less a road and more a suggestion of one. Twice I had to exit the truck to move fallen branches. The sky had clouded over, casting the forest into premature twilight. I began to wonder if I'd made a wrong turn when the trees finally thinned, revealing a clearing ahead. I emerged from the forest to find myself at what appeared to be a dead end. The clearing was roughly circular, about 50 yards across, surrounded completely by dense woods. At its center stood a small cabin, set back from where the road terminated in a patch of overgrown weeds. No vehicles were visible, no smoke rose from the chimney. Nothing indicated human presence except the building itself, a single-story structure with wood siding weathered to a uniform gray. If not for the package on my passenger seat, I would have assumed the place was abandoned. I checked my watch. 3:47 p.m. The sun would be setting in less than an hour. Company policy dictated that undeliverable packages should be returned to the depot, but that would mean navigating these roads in darkness. Better to attempt the delivery now. I reached for my scanner and the small box addressed to Occupant 6708 Timber Ridge Road. The package was lightweight, about the size of a hardcover book, wrapped in standard brown paper with no return address. Nothing unusual except for its destination. I stepped out of the truck, immediately struck by the profound silence of the clearing. No birds called. No insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed to have died completely, leaving the air unnaturally still. For the first time that day, a distinct sense of unease settled over me like a physical weight. The first thing I noticed was how the clearing seemed deliberately maintained. Unlike the overgrown road, the open space around the cabin had been kept clear of saplings and underbrush. Not neatly mowed like a lawn, but methodically cleared, as if someone regularly patrolled the perimeter with tools designed for cutting back the forest's constant encroachment. I approached slowly, scanning my surroundings with increasing discomfort. The cabin itself appeared older than I initially thought, perhaps built in the 1950s, with architectural elements that hadn't been in style for generations. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the wooden steps leading to the front porch had been reinforced with cinder blocks where they'd begun to rot. What struck me as odd was the presence of modern technology attached to this decaying structure. A satellite dish was mounted on the roof. Not just one, but 3 separate dishes positioned at different angles. A 4th dish lay on the ground nearby, partially overgrown with weeds. The incongruity was jarring, like finding a smartphone in a medieval castle. As I approached the cabin, I noticed something else that stopped me momentarily. What I had assumed was an abandoned vehicle tucked against the tree line was actually the rusted shell of an old pickup truck. Nature had begun to reclaim it. Vines grew through the empty engine compartment, and the cab was filled with decades of fallen leaves. But it hadn't been dumped there. It had been parked, and then simply left to decay in place. I resumed my walk toward the cabin, the package clutched in my hand. My footsteps sounded unnaturally loud in the silence, each crunch of gravel beneath my boots announcing my presence. I found myself walking more carefully, placing each foot with deliberate precision to minimize noise. The front yard, if it could be called that, contained no personal items, no forgotten tools, no outdoor furniture, nothing to suggest regular use of the space. Just bare dirt and patches of stubborn weeds. I reached the bottom of the steps and paused, listening for any indication of movement within. Nothing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and ineffectual in the oppressive quiet. "Delivery service." No response came from within. I hesitated, then mounted the steps one at a time, wincing at their creaking protest under my weight. The porch boards seemed solid enough, though weathered to a silvery gray. A single bare light bulb was mounted above the door, unlit. The front door was the most modern thing about the structure. Solid wood with a large glass pane in its upper half. The glass was surprisingly clean compared to the rest of the exterior, as if recently wiped. I raised my hand to knock, then froze as I caught my first glimpse of the interior. Through the glass, I could see directly into what should have been the main living area. The room was completely empty except for 2 metal folding chairs placed in its center. Not against a wall, not arranged conversationally, but positioned side by side, both facing the corner of the room. The corner itself contained nothing. No television, no shrine, no object of any kind. Just two chairs facing a blank wall. I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end. Something about those chairs, their deliberate placement, their solitary purpose, suggested a ritual or behavior I couldn't comprehend. They seemed to be waiting for occupants. I nearly turned away then. Every instinct urged me to return to my truck and leave the package on the porch. But professional habit took over, and I knocked firmly on the doorframe. The sound echoed through the apparently empty structure. I waited 30 seconds, then knocked again, louder this time. "Package delivery," I called out, my voice noticeably strained. When no response came, I tried the door handle, finding it locked. Following protocol, I set the package down in front of the door, took a photo with my scanner to confirm delivery, and backed away, still facing the cabin. As I retreated, my gaze drifted to a window on the side of the structure. Through dirty glass, I could make out what appeared to be a kitchen. Unlike the main room, this one contained ancient appliances, a refrigerator with rounded corners from the mid-century, a stove with mechanical dials. But like the main room, it showed no signs of recent use. No dishes, no food containers, no evidence of habitation. The entire structure appeared to be a shell, maintained just enough to keep standing, but not actually lived in. Except for those chairs, deliberately placed and waiting. My unease crystallized into genuine fear. Something was profoundly wrong with this place. Whatever its purpose, it wasn't simply a home. The decision to leave came with absolute clarity. I turned and walked briskly toward my truck, no longer concerned about the noise of my footsteps. My mind raced through possibilities, each more disturbing than the last. Was this a hunting cabin, rarely used, a meeting place for illicit activities, or something darker, a location deliberately isolated for purposes I didn't want to contemplate? As I walked, I removed my company cap and hood, improving my peripheral vision. The forest surrounding the clearing now seemed less like wilderness and more like a wall, a deliberate barrier keeping this place hidden from the outside world. I scanned the tree line, suddenly certain I was being observed. About 30 yards from my truck, the weight of unseen scrutiny became overwhelming. The sensation of being watched intensified until it felt like physical pressure against my back, increasing with each step I took away from the cabin. I resisted the urge to run, maintaining a measured pace while fighting against mounting panic. I reached my truck, fumbled briefly with the door handle, then climbed inside and immediately locked all doors. The simple click of the locks engaging provided only minimal comfort. I started the engine, its rumble unnaturally loud in the silent clearing. Before pulling away, I performed a thorough check of the truck's interior, peering into the back storage area to ensure I was truly alone. The irrational fear that someone might have slipped into my vehicle while I was at the cabin briefly overwhelmed logical thought. Finding nothing, I shifted into reverse and began the careful process of turning around in the limited space. My eyes constantly darted between my path and the cabin's front door, half expecting to see it open, revealing whoever or whatever belonged in those two chairs. The door remained closed. The cabin remained still. Nothing visibly changed as I completed my turn and pointed the truck back toward the narrow road that had brought me here. As I accelerated toward the forest's edge, a new fear emerged. What if the road was now blocked? The thought seized me with such certainty that I nearly braked to a stop. It would be simple enough to fell a tree across the narrow path, trapping my vehicle in the clearing. I shook off the thought and pressed forward, relief washing over me as the truck entered the tunnel-like path without obstruction. Navigating back proved even more challenging than the approach. Branches seemed to reach lower, ruts appeared deeper, and the gathering dusk transformed the forest into a maze of shadows. I drove with intense concentration, determined to put as much distance as possible between myself and the cabin before full darkness descended. The truck's headlights created shifting patterns of light and dark as I wound through the trees, illuminating the road just a few yards ahead at a time. In my mirrors, darkness swallowed the path behind me almost immediately. I had traveled perhaps half a mile when something ahead caught in my headlights. a dark mass in the middle of the narrow road. I slowed, squinting to identify the obstacle. As I drew closer, the object resolved into a large black garbage bag, partially open, positioned directly in my path. The bag hadn't been there during my approach. Someone had placed it there while I was at the cabin. I brought the truck to a stop about 20 feet from the bag, headlights illuminating its glossy black surface and the contents partially visible through its opening. From my position, I could make out what appeared to be fabric. Something with a pattern, possibly clothing. A woman's sweater, maybe. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. The bag's placement was deliberate, not accidental roadside trash, but an object meant to make me stop, to force me to exit my vehicle. For a moment, I considered attempting to drive around it, but the narrow road offered little room to maneuver. Driving over it seemed equally dangerous. What if it contained something that could damage my tires? A third option presented itself. Reverse course, find another way out. But that would mean returning toward the cabin, potentially encountering whoever had placed the bag in my path. As I sat frozen in indecision, a new, horrifying thought emerged. What if the bag contained not just clothing, but human remains? What if I had interrupted something at the cabin, some terrible act that had already been committed, and this was evidence being disposed of? The implications cascaded through my mind. The empty cabin with chairs facing the corner, the multiple satellite dishes, the absence of personal effects. Could it be what I initially feared? A location where people were held against their will? A place of captivity and worse? My breathing grew rapid and shallow as I stared at the garbage bag. The fading daylight cast long shadows through the trees, creating a disorienting pattern across the road. I needed to act, but each option carried its own risk. I reached for my phone out of habit only to find no service, as expected in these remote hills. I was entirely on my own, with only my judgment to rely on. After several minutes of paralyzed deliberation, I made my decision. I would drive around the bag, staying on the road as much as possible. The truck's clearance should handle the shallow ditch if I maneuvered carefully. I put the vehicle in drive and approached slowly, angling toward the right side of the narrow road. As I drew alongside the bag, I allowed myself a closer look at its contents. Through the partially open top, I could indeed see what appeared to be a woman's sweater, pale blue with a pattern I couldn't quite discern. Something else was visible beneath it, dark and irregularly shaped. My imagination supplied horrifying possibilities. The truck's tires dipped into the shallow ditch as I navigated around the obstacle. For one terrifying moment, I felt the vehicle tilt slightly toward the right, threatening to slide further off the road. I corrected carefully, applying gentle pressure to the accelerator, and felt the wheels catch and pull me forward. Once past the bag, I straightened the truck and accelerated, pushing the vehicle faster than was safe on the rough terrain. My heart pounded against my ribs as I focused on escaping the narrow forest road. Every shadow among the trees seemed to move with purpose. Every sound from the surrounding woods registered as a potential threat. I reached the fork where I'd originally turned right and continued straight, following what I hoped was the path back to Timber Ridge Road proper. The truck bounced violently over exposed roots and rocks, my body tensing with each impact as I anticipated a tire blowout or mechanical failure that would strand me in these woods. After what seemed like hours but was likely only minutes, the trees thinned and the road widened. I emerged onto the main gravel section of Timber Ridge, the relative openness feeling like salvation. I didn't slow down until I reached the paved county road, where I finally pulled onto the shoulder and cut the engine. The sudden silence was broken only by my ragged breathing and the ticking of the cooling engine. I sat motionless, trying to process what I'd just experienced. The rational part of my mind suggested innocent explanations, an eccentric hermit with unusual living arrangements perhaps. A hunting cabin rarely used except during specific seasons. Abandoned property with strange decorative choices. But those chairs. The multiple satellite dishes. The garbage bag appearing in my path. I glanced at my watch. 4:32 p.m. Less than an hour had passed since I'd first arrived at the cabin, though it felt like days. I still had 3 deliveries remaining on my route, but completing them was unthinkable now. I needed to report what I'd seen. But what exactly had I seen? Nothing definitively criminal, just deeply unsettling. Would anyone take me seriously? Would my concerns be dismissed as overactive imagination or end-of-day fatigue? I started the truck again and pulled back onto the road, heading toward the nearest town where I knew I could get cell service. As I drove, a new thought occurred to me. I should document what I'd found. If something truly sinister was happening at that cabin, evidence would be crucial. The thought of returning to that isolated clearing made my stomach clench, but the alternative, saying nothing, doing nothing, seemed equally unbearable. What if someone was being held there against their will? What if the clothing in that bag belonged to a victim? I reached the small town of Millerton 15 minutes later and pulled into a gas station parking lot. My phone immediately registered service, multiple missed notifications appearing on the screen. I ignored them and called my friend who worked as a security consultant, someone who would understand the gravity of my suspicions without dismissing them outright. He listened without interruption as I described the cabin, the chairs, the satellite dishes, and the garbage bag. When I finished, his response was immediate and unequivocal. Take photos, as many as you can, but don't approach the cabin again. Stay in your vehicle. Document the location, the bag, anything unusual, then call the sheriff directly. I knew he was right. Without evidence, my account would sound like paranoid fantasy. I needed proof. The decision to return went against every instinct for self-preservation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening at that cabin, something that would continue if no one intervened. I checked my fuel gauge, 3/4 full, ensured my phone was fully charged, and texted my location and intentions to my friend as a precaution. The drive back to Timber Ridge Road felt surreal, as if I were deliberately returning to a nightmare I'd just escaped. The late afternoon had given way to early evening, the overcast sky darkening rapidly. I switched on my headlights as I turned onto the gravel road, the beams catching dust particles that swirled in the air before my truck. I drove more slowly this time, alert for any sign of other vehicles or movement along the roadside. The forest seemed different somehow, more watchful, more alive with hidden purpose. I repeatedly checked my mirrors, half expecting to see headlights following behind me. At the entrance to the narrow path leading to the cabin, I paused. The rational part of my mind argued forcefully against proceeding. I had no weapon, no backup, no real plan beyond taking photographs. If someone was monitoring the road, and the strategically placed garbage bag suggested someone was, they would know I had returned. But the thought of potential victims, perhaps at this very moment imprisoned in some hidden part of the property, overcame my hesitation. I turned onto the path, proceeding with even greater caution than before. The forest closed around me once again, branches scraping against the truck's sides. I drove at walking pace, eyes constantly scanning for obstacles or figures among the trees. The silence outside was absolute. No birds, no insects, as if all wildlife had abandoned this place. I approached the location where I'd encountered the garbage bag, slowing even further. My headlights illuminated the narrow road ahead, revealing nothing. The bag was gone. I stopped the truck, staring in disbelief at the empty road. There was no trace of the black plastic, no indication it had ever been there. I checked and double-checked my location, certain I hadn't confused the spot. This was definitely where I'd seen the bag, where I'd been forced to navigate around it less than 30 minutes earlier. Its absence confirmed my worst fears. Someone was actively monitoring this road, someone who had returned to remove evidence after I'd passed. The realization sent adrenaline coursing through my system, sharpening every sense to painful clarity. I considered turning back immediately but forced myself to continue. If someone had removed the bag, they might have returned to the cabin as well. This might be my only chance to document whatever was happening there. I proceeded to the clearing, approaching with headlights off to minimize my visibility. The cabin appeared exactly as I'd left it, dark, still, seemingly abandoned. I parked at the forest's edge, positioning the truck for a quick exit, and took out my phone. Using the camera's zoom function, I captured images of the cabin from a distance. The external satellite dishes, the weathered structure, the clean front door with its glass pane. I photographed the surrounding clearing, the overgrown pickup truck, and what appeared to be a small shed partially hidden behind the main structure that I hadn't noticed during my first visit. I switched to video mode and recorded a brief narration, describing the location, the date and time, and what I'd observed earlier. My voice sounded strained even to my own ears, but I forced myself to provide clear, detailed information. As I finished recording, movement caught my eye. A brief flicker of light from one of the cabin's side windows. So brief I might have imagined it, except that I was staring directly at the building through my phone's screen. Someone was inside. I froze, phone still raised, barely breathing. Had they seen me? Were they watching even now as I sat exposed in my vehicle? I started the engine with shaking hands, no longer concerned about stealth. As the headlights came on automatically, they illuminated something I hadn't noticed during my approach. A thin trail leading from the cabin into the forest on the clearing's far side. Not a formal path, but a line of disturbed vegetation, as if something heavy had been dragged repeatedly along the same route. I wanted desperately to investigate, to follow that trail and discover what lay at its end. But self-preservation finally overrode curiosity. I put the truck in reverse, executed a rapid three-point turn, and accelerated back toward the forest road. As I drove, I checked my side mirrors repeatedly, watching the cabin recede into darkness. No lights appeared in its windows. No figure emerged to pursue me. The structure simply stood in silent witness to my retreat, revealing nothing of its secrets. I didn't stop until I reached the county sheriff's office in Millerton, pulling into the nearly empty parking lot just past 6 p.m. The station was a single-story brick building with fluorescent lights glowing from within, promising safety and rationality after the unsettling isolation of the forest. Inside, I approached the desk sergeant, a heavy-set man with graying hair and a skeptical expression that deepened as I explained my reason for coming in. He listened without interruption, making occasional notes, his face revealing nothing. When I finished my account and offered to show him the photos I'd taken, he nodded slowly. So you're saying you delivered a package to an empty house, saw some chairs facing a wall, noticed some satellite dishes, and found a trash bag in the road that later disappeared. Put that way, it sounded absurdly innocuous. I tried again, emphasizing the strangeness of the scene, the deliberately positioned chairs, the trail leading into the forest, the feeling of being watched. Mr. Baker, the sergeant said finally, using the name from my driver's license, I understand you found this situation unusual, but we can't investigate private property based on furniture arrangements or satellite equipment. As for the trash bag, people dump garbage on those back roads all the time. Someone probably picked it up. But why would it appear exactly when I was leaving the cabin? And why would someone remove it so quickly afterward? I pressed. He sighed, the sound of a man accustomed to dealing with overactive imaginations. Could be coincidence. Could be the property owner saw it and cleaned it up. Without evidence of actual criminal activity, there's not much we can do. I showed him the photos on my phone, which he examined with mild interest. They looked less compelling than I'd hoped. Just images of a rundown cabin in poor lighting. Nothing visibly suspicious. I'll tell you what, he said finally. I'll make a note of your concerns. Deputy Wilson knows that area well. Next time he's patrolling out that way, he can drive by and check the property. It wasn't the immediate response I'd hoped for, but it was something. I provided detailed directions to the cabin, described the package I'd delivered, and gave my contact information. Before leaving, I asked one final question. Has anyone ever reported problems with that address before? The sergeant's expression changed subtly, a slight tightening around the eyes that lasted only a moment. Not that I recall offhand, he said, too casually. But I can check the records if you'd like. Please, I said. He typed something into his computer, studied the screen longer than seemed necessary, then looked up. No reports associated with that specific address. But as I mentioned, Deputy Wilson knows that area. I'll have him look into it. I left the station with the distinct impression that the sergeant knew more than he was willing to share. Whether due to official procedure or personal reluctance, he had withheld something. Some piece of information that might have validated my concerns. I returned to the delivery depot to complete my paperwork and park the company truck. The familiar surroundings, the fluorescent lit warehouse, the sound of packages being sorted, co-workers chatting about ordinary frustrations, should have been comforting. Instead, they felt surreal, as if I'd returned from another dimension where the normal rules of reality didn't apply. My supervisor questioned my incomplete route, but I offered a vague explanation about feeling ill after lunch. He seemed more concerned about rescheduling the remaining deliveries than about my obvious distress. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those chairs facing the empty corner. I imagined what might happen in that room, who might sit in those chairs, what they might be forced to watch or do or endure. I researched online, looking for any information about the address or surrounding area. County property records showed the land had changed ownership multiple times over the past decade, always through private sales with minimal documentation. The current listed owner was a limited liability company with an address in another state. I searched for missing persons reports in the surrounding counties, finding more than I'd expected. Dozens of cases spanning years, most involving young women traveling alone or individuals last seen in rural areas. How many of them might have ended up in that cabin, facing that corner? The thought kept me awake until dawn. After my unsettling experience at that isolated cabin, I resigned from the delivery company. Though I'd been considering a career change already, the encounter with those eerily positioned chairs and the mysterious disappearing garbage bag pushed me to make the decision. I couldn't bear the thought of continuing to drive those remote roads, potentially encountering similar disturbing situations. Before leaving, I spoke with my supervisor about removing the address from regular delivery routes. I provided a sanitized version of my experience, emphasizing safety concerns. He agreed that packages for such remote locations could be held for pickup instead. I also asked to be informed if police ever inquired about the Timber Ridge Road address. To my knowledge, no such inquiry ever came. In the weeks that followed, I regularly contacted the sheriff's office about Deputy Wilson's promised investigation. Their responses grew increasingly evasive, citing reassignments, schedule changes, and staffing shortages, until they stopped taking my calls altogether. I considered contacting higher authorities, but realized my evidence was too insubstantial to warrant serious investigation. 2 months later, I relocated to another county, creating physical distance between myself and Timber Ridge Road. Despite this, the memory persisted in recurring nightmares. About 6 months after the incident, I discovered a news article about hunters finding human remains in the national forest adjacent to Timber Ridge. When I contacted the reporter, he revealed that fabric fragments had been found with the remains in an area near Timber Ridge. This connection left me deeply unsettled, though I never learned whether the remains were linked to the cabin. I often wonder if I should have done more. But then I remember the oppressive sensation of being watched in that clearing and the inexplicably appearing and disappearing garbage bag. I tried to reassure myself that alerting authorities fulfilled my moral obligation. Yet during sleepless nights, I find myself wondering about subsequent deliveries to that cabin, and whether others noticed those chairs facing the corner, waiting for their next occupants. Somewhere in those hills, that cabin still stands, a shell potentially harboring unimaginable horrors, hidden from a world that doesn't want to see. I never believed in monsters until I inherited one. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, its manila envelope stiff with official-looking documents. My great-uncle Liam had died, leaving me his remote property in northern Michigan, a family cabin I'd never known existed on the shores of what the locals called Lake Wanagiska. According to the attorney's letter, the name came from Ojibwe, roughly translating to White Shadow Waters. The cabin and surrounding 50 acres had been in our family for generations, though no one had lived there permanently for decades. My life in the city had grown stale. a recent layoff, a relationship that ended badly, and an apartment that felt increasingly like a cage all pushed me toward this unexpected opportunity. The timing seemed fortuitous, almost as if the universe was clearing my path. Within 2 weeks, I had packed my modest belongings into my Subaru and headed north, following directions that took me progressively farther from highways, then paved roads, and finally, onto a dirt track that disappeared into dense forest. The attorney's description hadn't done justice to the cabin's isolation. As I followed the increasingly narrow road through thick stands of old-growth pine and maple, the early October sunlight filtered through branches in dappled patterns. My cell signal had disappeared miles back, and the GPS had given up entirely, leaving me to navigate by printed directions and sparse trail markers. Just when I began to worry I'd missed a turn, the forest opened slightly, and I caught my first glimpse of Lake Wanagaiska through the trees. The water reflected the late afternoon sun, shimmering like polished silver. At the lake's edge stood the cabin, rustic but larger than I'd expected, with a broad covered porch facing the water and a stone chimney rising from its shingled roof. I parked beside a weathered shed and stepped out, stretching after the long drive. The air smelled of pine and water, crisp with autumn's approach. Silence enveloped me. No traffic noise, no human voices, just the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the occasional call of a bird. Something about the quality of that silence felt weighted, as if the forest was holding its breath, watching. The cabin key was exactly where the attorney had said it would be, tucked behind a loose stone in the chimney. Inside, the space was surprisingly well maintained, dusty but not decrepit. The main room featured massive windows overlooking the lake, a stone fireplace, and rustic furniture draped with protective sheets. A kitchen area occupied one corner, while stairs led to what I assumed was a loft sleeping area. 2 doors off the main room presumably led to additional bedrooms or storage. I spent that first afternoon unloading my car and exploring the cabin. In a desk drawer, I found a leather-bound journal, my great-uncle's, from the dates inside. His last entry was from just 3 months earlier, belying the attorney's claim that no one had used the property in years. The handwriting was shaky but legible. "It's watching again from the tree line. 3rd night in a row. Tomorrow I'll try to photograph it, though I know from experience it doesn't show up well in pictures." The Ojibwe called it Wanagaiska, not just the lake but the creature itself, the white shadow that walks. The locals pretend it doesn't exist, but their eyes betray their knowledge. They fear what they won't name. I dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man living alone in the woods, yet something about those words raised the hair on my neck. Through the window, I watched the sun sink behind the trees across the lake, casting long shadows across the water. As daylight faded, the forest beyond the clearing seemed to deepen, becoming an impenetrable wall of darkness. That night, I built a fire in the fireplace and continued reading my great-uncle's journal by its light. His entries chronicled years of solitary life at the cabin, interspersed with increasingly frequent mentions of strange occurrences, unexplained sounds in the night, footprints too large to be human around the property, glimpses of movement at the forest's edge. "I know why my grandfather built this cabin here," one entry read. "Not for the fishing or the views as he claimed, but to watch over this place, to guard what sleeps beneath Wanagaiska. The responsibility passes to each generation. I've failed to pass it on. There was no one to tell." Sleep came uneasily that first night. The cabin creaked and settled around me, unfamiliar sounds that my mind transformed into footsteps, breathing, scratching at the walls. I told myself it was just the wind, just the normal sounds of an old structure in the woods. Just my imagination, primed by an old man's delusional writings. Dawn brought clarity and embarrassment over my midnight fears. The lake stretched before me, mist rising from its surface in ghostly tendrils that dissipated in the morning light. Birds called from the trees and a pair of deer grazed cautiously at the forest's edge. The world seemed peaceful, ordinary. After breakfast, I decided to explore the property. A well-worn path led around the lake's perimeter. I followed it, noting old stone markers at irregular intervals, each carved with a symbol that resembled a stylized eye, My great-uncle's journal hadn't mentioned these. About half a mile from the cabin, the path veered away from the lakeshore and into denser forest. Here, the trees grew closer together, branches intertwining overhead to create a natural tunnel. The ground sloped gradually upward, leading to what appeared to be a small clearing ahead. The clearing was perfectly circular, as if deliberately formed. At its center stood a stone structure, not quite a building, more like a small shrine or monument. It was constructed of flat stones stacked without mortar, forming a cube about 4 feet high with a single opening facing east. Inside the opening, a stone pedestal held what looked like a carved wooden mask, weathered with age but still discernible as a face with deep-set eyes and an elongated jaw. I approached cautiously, feeling like an intruder. The air in the clearing seemed different, heavier, charged with something I couldn't identify. As I reached for the mask, a sound from behind me froze my hand in midair. A snapping twig, then silence. I turned slowly, scanning the trees that encircled the clearing. Nothing moved, yet I couldn't shake the certainty that I was being watched. My gaze traveled the perimeter, searching for any sign of movement or color that didn't belong. Then I saw it. Not a movement, but an absence of movement, a stillness too perfect to be natural. Between 2 ancient oaks at the clearing's edge stood a shape that at first glance seemed to be part of the forest itself, tall and indistinct, neither fully visible nor fully hidden. For several heartbeats I stared at that shape, trying to resolve it into something recognizable. A tree, a shadow, a trick of light. Then it moved, just slightly, a subtle shift of weight that no shadow could mimic. I glimpsed massive shoulders, a head that seemed too high among the branches, and then, most disturbingly, eyes reflecting the morning light with a dull reddish glow. Fear locked my muscles. I couldn't run, couldn't call out, could barely breathe. The shape remained motionless, watching me with those reflective eyes. Then, deliberately, it stepped backward and was absorbed into the darkness between the trees, leaving only swaying branches to mark its passage. I ran then, abandoning all pretense of courage, sprinting down the path toward the cabin with my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't slow until I reached the porch, slamming the door behind me and throwing the deadbolt with shaking hands. Safe inside, rationality returned in fragments. It must have been a bear, I told myself. A moose, perhaps, or even a particularly large deer seen from an odd angle. The red-eye effect was just sunlight reflecting off an animal's retinas. The human-like stance was my imagination, influenced by my great-uncle's writings. But deep down, I knew these explanations were attempts to paper over a truth my mind wasn't ready to accept. What I'd seen hadn't been any animal known to these woods. And somehow, on an instinctual level, I understood that it was connected to this place, to Lake Wanagiska, to the strange shrine in the clearing, and to the responsibility my great-uncle had failed to pass on. That night I returned to his journal with new purpose, reading entry after entry by flashlight when the power flickered and died during a sudden thunderstorm. Outside, rain lashed the windows, and lightning illuminated the lake in strobing flashes. Between thunderclaps, I heard noises on the porch. Heavy footsteps, a sound like claws scraping wood, and once, a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the cabin's walls. I told myself it was just the storm, but in the journal's pages, I found my great-uncle's voice speaking across time. When it comes in the rain, it's searching. The water masks its scent, allows it to get closer. It's drawn to fear. It can smell it like sharks smell blood. Stay calm. Stay still. Remember what sleeps beneath Wanagiska must remain asleep. I didn't understand. But as the night deepened and the noises outside grew more persistent, I realized with growing dread that understanding might be the key to survival. Morning revealed claw marks on the porch railing, deep gouges in the wood that hadn't been there the day before. Massive footprints in the mud led from the forest's edge to the cabin and back again, their shape distinctly humanoid but much too large, nearly 16 inches long with 5 toe impressions. No bear made prints like these. I photographed them with shaking hands, then traced the trail to where it disappeared into the underbrush. The forest seemed innocent in daylight, birds singing among sun-dappled branches, but I no longer trusted its peaceful facade. Something was out there, something that had circled my cabin in the night, testing doors and windows, searching for a way in. Back inside, I returned to my great-uncle's journal, searching for answers. The entries grew increasingly erratic over the final months, blending observations with local legends and personal theories. One passage caught my attention. Local librarians showed me old missionary records from 1700s. Described a tribe that once lived around this lake, not Ojibwe but older, perhaps wiped out before Europeans fully documented the region. They worshipped something they called the Keeper of Dreams that lived beneath the water, made sacrifices to keep it sleeping. The stone markers around the lake form a boundary, a cage of sorts. The creature I see is drawn to the lake but fears to cross the markers. I remembered the stone pillars with eye-like carvings I'd noticed along the lakeshore path. Was it possible they served some protective function? It seemed absurd, yet the precision of their placement suggested purpose rather than decoration. Another entry provided more disturbing details. Sheriff came today after I reported tracks, acted concerned, took photos, made report, but saw him later at the store laughing with locals. They know, all of them know. Just let it be, he told me when I confronted him. Your family's watched over that thing for generations. Nothing good comes from poking at it. When I pressed, he admitted 3 hikers disappeared in these woods last spring. Bodies never found. The implications chilled me. If the locals knew about this creature, why hadn't they warned me? Was there some unspoken agreement to keep silent, to protect the town's reputation, or perhaps something darker? I needed information, and the cabin's isolation suddenly felt suffocating rather than peaceful. I decided to drive into the nearest town, Lakewood, about 20 miles south, to stock up on supplies and perhaps cautiously inquire about the property's history. Lakewood proved to be a small settlement of weathered buildings clustered around a single main street. The general store doubled as a post office and diner, with a handful of locals nursing coffee at a counter. Conversations hushed noticeably when I entered, eyes tracking me with what I now recognized as wary assessment rather than small-town curiosity. The clerk, a gray-haired woman with deep smile lines and watchful eyes, greeted me with rehearsed cheer. Passing through or staying a while? Just moved into a cabin on Lake Wanagiska, I replied, watching closely for her reaction. Inherited it from my great-uncle Liam. Something flickered behind her polite smile. Recognition, perhaps concern. The McAllister place. Been a while since anyone's lived there full-time. Did you know my uncle? Everyone knows everyone around here. She began ringing up my groceries with efficient movements. He kept to himself mostly, especially these past few years. I found his journal, I said casually. Interesting reading. He mentioned something about local legends regarding the lake. Her hands paused briefly. Every lake has its stories. He seemed particularly interested in one about a creature in the woods. Called it Wanagiska. The store fell silent. Even the clink of coffee cups ceased. The clerk's smile had vanished entirely. We don't talk about those old stories, she said quietly. They're just superstition from a less enlightened time. An older man at the counter turned toward me. Your uncle stirred things up that were better left settled. Asked too many questions, went looking for trouble. His weathered face hardened. Some folks think that's what happened to him in the end. What do you mean? I was told he died of a heart attack. No one answered. The clerk finished bagging my groceries with deliberate movements. That'll be $47.50. I paid, sensing further questions would yield nothing. As I turned to leave, the old man spoke again. Word of advice, stranger. That cabin sits on a special kind of ground. Always has. Your family's always known that, kept watch over it. You want to stay there, you'd best honor the old ways. Don't go wandering after dark. Don't disturb what's marked. And if you see something in the woods, you leave it be. Outside, I loaded my groceries into the car, the man's warning echoing in my mind. The town's reaction confirmed my suspicions. They knew something about the creature, about my property, perhaps even about my great-uncle's death that contradicted the official story. Back at the cabin, I searched more thoroughly, looking for anything that might explain these cryptic warnings. In a locked chest in the cabin's cellar, I found a collection of old documents, land deeds, maps, and a leather folder containing what appeared to be family records dating back to the 1800s. One document caught my eye, a letter dated 1879 from my great-great-grandfather to his son. The responsibility I pass to you is grave. Our family made a pact generations ago with the last shaman of the Mishinimaki people. We would guard this place, maintain the stone wardens, and in return the creature they bound would spare our blood. Break this covenant at your peril. What sleeps beneath Wanagiska must remain there, for if it wakes, no power on earth can contain it again. The guardian that walks the shore is but its servant, a fragment of its consciousness given form. Fear it, respect it, but remember it is not the true danger. Accompanying the letter was a crude drawing of a bipedal creature with disproportionately long arms, a sloped forehead, and eyes that the artist had heavily shaded. In the background was a stylized representation of a lake with a massive shape beneath its surface. My hands trembled as I replaced the documents. The rational part of my mind still resisted, still searched for a logical explanation. Perhaps a family tradition of conservation recast through superstition, or local legends attached to unusual wildlife. But the footprints outside, the town's reaction, my own sighting in the clearing, all pointed to something very real stalking the woods around Lake Wanagiska. As afternoon faded toward evening, I secured the cabin as best I could, checking locks, closing shutters, bringing in firewood for the night. Through the windows, I watched the lake turn golden, then red, then deepening blue as the sun set. The surface was glass smooth, reflecting the emerging stars like a perfect mirror. Then, as full dark settled, I noticed something disturbing. Ripples spreading from the center of the lake, as if something large was moving beneath the surface. The ripples grew stronger, water splashing against the shore in what almost resembled a pulse, a massive heartbeat. I extinguished the cabin lights and watched from darkness as the ripples continued for several minutes before gradually subsiding. When the water had been still for half an hour, I relaxed slightly, only to tense again at a sound from the forest's edge. Peering through the gloom, I saw it again, that unnaturally tall silhouette, moving with a fluid grace that belied its size. It emerged partially from the trees, massive head lifted as if testing the air. In the faint moonlight, I could make out more details than before. The shaggy outline, the powerful shoulders, the unnervingly human-like posture. It was easily 8 feet tall, possibly larger. It moved toward the lake, stopping at the tree line. For several long minutes, it stood absolutely still, staring across the water. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned its head toward the cabin, toward the window where I watched. Even at this distance, I felt the weight of its gaze, a pressure against my consciousness that triggered instinctive terror. It knew I was watching. It knew exactly where I was. And somehow, I sensed it was measuring me, judging whether I posed a threat to whatever purpose brought it to the lakeshore night after night. Then, with a fluid motion that seemed too fast for its bulk, it melted back into the forest, leaving me shaking and uncertain whether I'd just been evaluated, warned, or marked. Sleep eluded me that night. I sat in the main room, a loaded shotgun across my knees, my great-uncle's, found in a locked cabinet, listening to the sounds of the forest and the occasional splash from the lake. Something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of this inheritance. I wasn't just the owner of a secluded cabin. I was now the reluctant guardian of whatever ancient secret lay beneath Lake Wanagiska. And whatever walked its shores was watching to see if I would honor that duty or flee. Dawn brought no relief, just a bone-deep exhaustion and lingering dread. I dozed fitfully in the chair, waking at every creak and rustle, the shotgun a cold weight across my lap. Outside, the lake shimmered innocently in the morning light, offering no hint of the strange ripples I'd witnessed the night before. Coffee in hand, I walked the property, examining the areas around the cabin. Near the boathouse, I found fresh tracks, the same massive humanoid prints, but this time accompanied by something else that froze my blood. A dead deer lay partially concealed beneath pine branches, its neck broken at an impossible angle. The carcass was intact except for the chest cavity, which had been opened with surgical precision. The heart was missing. This wasn't a natural predator's kill. Natural predators don't cover their prey or take only specific organs. This was ritualistic, deliberate, a message left where I would find it. Back in the cabin, I re-examined my great-uncle's journal and the family documents with new urgency. References to offerings and appeasement appeared repeatedly, suggesting a traditional practice of leaving gifts, perhaps food, for the creature. Had my great-uncle maintained this tradition? Was this kill a demand for continuation? The more immediate question: was I in danger? The creature clearly knew I was here and seemed to be demonstrating its power rather than attacking outright. But how long would that restraint last? I considered leaving, packing up and returning to city life, selling the property and washing my hands of this entire bizarre situation. But something held me back. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or curiosity, or some deeper connection to this place and the family duty it represented. Whatever the reason, I decided to stay, at least long enough to understand what I was dealing with. The local library seemed the logical next step in my investigation. I drove back to Lakewood, parking outside a small brick building that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Inside, a young woman with glasses and a wary expression greeted me from behind a desk stacked with books. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. "I'm researching local history," I replied. "Specifically legends about Lake Wanagiska and the surrounding area." Her expression didn't change, but her posture stiffened slightly. "Most of our local history section focuses on the town's founding and development. We don't have much on folklore." My great-uncle's journal mentioned he found information here. Old missionary records about a tribe that lived around the lake before the Ojibwe. She hesitated, conflict visible behind her professional facade. Finally, she sighed. "Your uncle was very persistent. I showed him materials that aren't in our general collection." She lowered her voice. "Come with me." She led me to a back room filled with filing cabinets and acid-free storage boxes. After ensuring we were alone, she unlocked a cabinet and removed a leather-bound volume protected by a clear archival sleeve. "This is Father Jean-Baptiste Moreau's journal from 1742 to 1747. He was a Jesuit missionary who traveled through this region, documenting the native populations." She handled the book with reverent care. His accounts aren't always reliable. He viewed everything through his religious perspective, but it's one of the few written records we have from that period. She opened the journal to a marked page, where faded ink recorded the priest's flowing script. The entry was dated June 1743. "Encountered a small band of natives who call themselves Mishinimaki, or People of the Great Spirit Lake. Unlike the Ojibwe with whom I have established good relations, these people are secretive and regard my presence with evident hostility. Their village is situated on a lake they will not name, saying only that to speak its true name is to attract the attention of what dwells within. Their customs are strange and I fear demonic in nature. They maintain a circle of stone markers around their lake, each carved with a warding symbol. Upon these stones, they place offerings of food and blood from their hunts. When I questioned this practice, their shaman explained through crude gestures and my interpreter's halting translation that these offerings are for the guardian that walks, which protects them from the sleeper beneath. I gather they believe some entity resides in the lake's depths, kept dormant through these pagan rituals. More disturbing still, they claim this guardian can take physical form, a towering beast that walks on two legs like a man, but possesses the strength and savagery of 10 bears. The description recalls the wild tales of Sasquatch I have heard from trappers, though I had dismissed these as mere frontier fantasy. The Mishinimaki believe they are bound to this place by ancient duty. When I offered to guide them to a mission settlement where they might find Christian salvation, their refusal was immediate and vehement. The shaman warned that should they abandon their vigil, the sleeper would wake and bring destruction beyond imagining. I looked up from the journal, processing this information. What happened to the Mishinimaki? The librarian shook her head. They disappear from the historical record after about 1760. The most likely explanation is that they were absorbed into larger tribes or wiped out by disease. European illnesses devastated many smaller native populations. And the lake? Does Father Moreau identify it? Not by name, but his descriptions of the surrounding geography suggest it was what we now call Lake Wanagiska. She closed the journal carefully. Your family's property has been there since the 1860s, one of the first non-native settlements in the area. Did my uncle find anything else? Any other historical references to the guardian or the sleeper? She hesitated again. He was particularly interested in disappearances around the lake. There have been several over the years, hikers, fishermen, a couple of researchers from the university studying forest ecology about a decade ago. Official explanations? The usual. People get lost in the wilderness, accidents happen, wild animal attacks. But... She glanced toward the door, then lowered her voice further. There's a pattern. Most disappearances happen in groups of 3, spaced a few days apart. Always during the spring or fall. Always near the lake. And they're often preceded by reports of unusual animal activity. Livestock killings, strange sounds at night, huge tracks found in the mud. Like what's happening now, I murmured, thinking of the dead deer and the creature's increasing boldness. She nodded grimly. Your uncle was asking the same questions right before he died. Sheriff said it was a heart attack, but... She trailed off. But what? The paramedics who responded said his body was cold when they arrived. Too cold, like he'd been outside all night. And there were scratches on the windows, deep ones that went through the glass. My blood chilled at the implication. You think something killed him? I think, she said carefully, that your uncle broke some rule he didn't fully understand. And I think you should be very careful about following in his footsteps. I thanked her for her help and left, my mind racing with new information. The drive back to the cabin felt longer, the forest pressing closer to the road, shadows deeper than they should have been in mid-afternoon. By the time I turned onto the dirt track leading to my property, the sun was already sinking toward the treetops. Something was wrong. I sensed it before I rounded the final bend. A stillness in the air, an absence of bird calls. The cabin came into view, apparently undisturbed, but my instincts screamed danger. I approached cautiously, shotgun ready. The front door stood open, swinging slightly in the breeze. I was certain I'd locked it before leaving. Inside, chaos greeted me. Furniture overturned, my great-uncle's journals and the family documents strewn across the floor. Deep gouges marked the walls and floor, as if massive claws had torn through the cabin in a frenzy. The destruction was systematic rather than random. Every hiding place had been searched, every container emptied. But the most disturbing detail awaited me in the bedroom. On the wall above the bed, something had used what looked like charcoal to draw a crude symbol. A circle with vertical lines extending downward, resembling an eye with dripping tears. Below it, 3 horizontal lines were drawn, the middle one partially erased. With sudden clarity, I understood. 3 lines, 1 partially erased. 2 remained. 2 more to go. 2 more disappearances before whatever ritual cycle the creature was enacting would be complete. And I now stood directly in its path. Night fell rapidly, darkness flowing like ink through the trees surrounding the cabin. I worked frantically to secure the space, boarding broken windows, barricading the damaged door, establishing a defensive position in the main room with clear sight lines to all potential entry points. The shotgun lay loaded beside me, though deep down I questioned whether it would have any effect against what stalked the woods. As I worked, I gathered the scattered papers and journals, arranging them to reconstruct the research my great-uncle had compiled. A pattern emerged from his notes, dates, and observations that painted a disturbing picture. Every 30 years, almost to the day, a cycle of disappearances occurred around Lake Wanagiska. Always in groups of 3, always followed by a period of absolute quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The current cycle had begun 2 weeks ago, with a backpacker who'd veered off the main trail miles from here. Search and rescue had found his campsite torn apart, blood on the ground, but no body. A week later, a local hunter had vanished, his truck found parked at a trailhead, his gear scattered through the woods. Both incidents had been attributed to bear attacks, despite the lack of evidence supporting that conclusion. I was to be the third. The realization settled over me with leaden certainty. But why me specifically? Was it simply opportunity, a solitary figure in a remote cabin? Or was there some deeper connection to my bloodline, to the covenant mentioned in my ancestor's letter? The answer emerged from a hidden compartment in my great-uncle's desk. A space I discovered only because the creature's search had damaged the locking mechanism. Inside lay a small leather-bound book far older than his journals, its pages brittle with age. The handwriting within was not his, but belonged to someone much earlier. My great-great-grandfather, judging by the dates. The book detailed the arrangement our family had made with the last shaman of the Mishinimaki people in 1868. In exchange for the land around Lake Wanagiska, my ancestor had sworn to maintain the stone markers, provide regular offerings to the guardian, and, most critically, ensure that one family member always remained as caretaker of the property. The shaman explained, one passage read, that without proper observation, the sleeper's hunger grows, causing it to reach out through its guardian to seek sustenance. Every 3rd decade, this hunger peaks and requires greater appeasement, the life essence of 3 souls. In ancient times, the tribe would sacrifice 3 volunteers from among their people. Without such willing offerings, the guardian hunts. My great-uncle had maintained this grim tradition until recently. His final journal entries revealed his growing moral conflict about the practice. I cannot continue this barbaric arrangement. The disappearances weigh on my conscience, lives lost to perpetuate a superstition. I've decided to break the cycle. I will not make the offerings this year. Perhaps without the ritual encouragement, the creature will simply hibernate or die. If there is a guardian, if there is a sleeper, let them come for me instead. They had. And now they had come for me. Outside, something moved in the darkness. A heavy footfall on the porch, then another. Wood creaked under significant weight. A low rumbling sound vibrated through the cabin walls. Not quite a growl, more like the subsonic purr of some massive predator. I raised the shotgun, aiming at the barricaded door. Minutes passed in tense silence. Then, unexpectedly, a sound from above. Movement on the roof. Claws or heavy nails scraped across the shingles, seeking weakness. A crash from the rear of the cabin shattered the silence, the bathroom window giving way. I swung the gun toward the hallway just as a massive shape filled the doorframe. In the dim light, I caught impressions rather than details. Height that forced it to stoop beneath the ceiling, broad shoulders covered in matted hair, arms too long for its already elongated frame. Its face remained in shadow, but 2 points of dull red light marked where its eyes must be. I fired without hesitation, the shotgun's roar deafening in the confined space. The creature jerked backward but didn't fall. Instead, it emitted a sound no earthly animal could make. A high, keening wail that seemed to originate from multiple throats simultaneously. It retreated down the hallway. I followed cautiously, gun ready for a second shot. The bathroom window gaped open to the night, glass shards littering the floor alongside dark droplets that could only be blood. I'd wounded it at least. A sudden impact shook the entire cabin, something massive striking the outer wall with tremendous force. Then again, and again, methodical blows testing the structure's integrity. I backed into the main room, positioning myself to cover all possible entry points. The assault on the walls ceased abruptly. In the silence that followed, I heard a new sound. Water sloshing rhythmically against the lakeshore, though there was no wind to create waves. Looking through a crack in the boarded window, I saw the lake's surface undulating, ripples spreading outward from the center as if something massive was rising from the depths. A distant memory surfaced, a line from the priest's journal. The guardian that walks protects them from the sleeper beneath. Two entities, not one. And I had wounded the guardian. As this realization dawned, the cabin's foundations trembled. The floorboards beneath my feet vibrated with increasing intensity. Cracks appeared in the stone fireplace, mortar dust raining down as the tremors grew stronger. This was no earthquake. This was something waking. I grabbed the essential documents and my pack, shoving them haphazardly inside along with ammunition and whatever food I could reach. The cabin was no longer safe. Perhaps nowhere was safe. But I couldn't just wait for the structure to collapse around me. As I prepared to flee, a final entry in my great-uncle's journal caught my eye. The stone shrine in the clearing holds the key. The mask is a vessel of containment, carved from the heartwood of a tree, struck by lightning during the binding ritual. The shaman's power is locked within it. Without the mask in place, the circle is broken. The mask I'd nearly touched during my exploration of the property. The wooden face with its deep-set eyes and elongated jaw. Had my presence there, my near disturbance of the artifact, weakened whatever binding it represented? I had no time to contemplate further. With a groaning sound, the cabin floor buckled upward, boards splintering as something pushed from below. I bolted for the door, tearing away the barricade and bursting onto the porch. Outside, the night had transformed. The placid lake now churned violently, waves crashing against the shore with unnatural force. The surrounding forest swayed as if in a hurricane, though the air was eerily still. And at the tree line stood the guardian, the creature I'd shot, watching me with those glowing eyes, making no move to attack. I ran toward the path that led around the lake, toward the stone shrine. If the mask was indeed key to containing whatever was waking beneath Wanagiska, I needed to ensure it remained in place. The guardian made no attempt to pursue me, which was somehow more terrifying than if it had given chase. The path was nearly invisible in the darkness, but I followed it by instinct and memory, aware of the lake's increasingly violent thrashing to my right. The stone markers I passed seemed to vibrate, the carved eye symbols appearing to watch me as I ran. The clearing, when I reached it, was transformed. Moonlight illuminated the perfect circle with unnatural brightness, as if the space existed in its own reality. The stone shrine stood at the center, unchanged except for one critical detail. The mask was no longer on its pedestal. Instead, it lay on the ground before the shrine, face down as if it had fallen or been deliberately removed. The wooden surface gleamed with an oily sheen that hadn't been present before. I approached cautiously, shotgun ready, scanning the clearing for any sign of the guardian. Finding none, I knelt beside the mask and reached out to restore it to its place. A voice stopped me. Not a physical sound, but words that formed directly in my mind, accompanied by impressions of ancient knowledge and inhuman patience. Child of the Covenant. Last of the bound bloodline. What do you seek here? The voice held neither malice nor benevolence, merely a cold curiosity that felt older than human civilization. I want to restore the balance, I answered aloud, feeling foolish yet certain I was being heard. To put the mask back and maintain the binding. The binding weakens. The cycle nears completion. The hunger grows. What are you? I asked, though I feared I already knew. I am the sleeper beneath, the dreamer whose nightmares walk the shore, the endless hunger your ancestors promised to sate. By sacrificing innocent people. By honoring the covenant. 3 lives every 30 years, freely given or forcibly taken, a small price for containing what would otherwise consume all. The ground trembled beneath me, the vibration traveling up through my bones. In the lake beyond the clearing, something massive broke the surface briefly, a shape too large, too alien to fully comprehend, before sinking again in a cascade of water. Your uncle refused the offering, broke the covenant. Now the binding fails, and I wake. And if I restore the mask, make the offerings? Then the cycle continues. I return to dreaming. The guardian returns to watching, until the next hunger comes. Moral repugnance warred with practical terror. Could I condemn others to maintain this monstrous arrangement? But the alternative, unleashing whatever ancient horror slept beneath Wanagiska, seemed unthinkably worse. There must be another way, I insisted. A permanent solution. There is. The mental voice took on a tone of dark amusement. Join me beneath. Become part of what sleeps and dreams. Your essence would satisfy for centuries, not decades. No more offerings, no more hunts. Self-sacrifice instead of sacrificing others, I murmured. Your uncle made the same choice in the end. His last offering. Himself. The revelation struck me like a physical blow. My great-uncle hadn't been killed by the guardian. He had willingly given himself to the sleeper, attempting to break the cycle of death permanently through his own sacrifice. But it hadn't been enough. Or perhaps, without the proper ritual, his sacrifice had merely postponed the inevitable. I stood at the crossroads of an impossible choice. Continue a tradition of periodic sacrifice, end my own life in hopes of a more lasting solution, or do nothing and let an ancient horror loose upon the world. As I deliberated, the clearing darkened. Looking up, I saw the guardian standing at the edge of the trees, its massive form silhouetted against the night sky. It made no move to approach, but its presence radiated expectation. The mask at my feet seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, calling to be restored to its rightful place. And beneath the lake, something waited for my decision. Dawn approached, tinging the eastern sky with faint gray light. I had spent the night in the clearing, alternating between frantic research through my great-uncle's papers and tense observation of the guardian, which maintained its vigil at the perimeter. The lake had gradually calmed as night progressed, suggesting the sleeper had retreated to deeper waters. But this was temporary respite, not resolution. I needed to decide. And soon. My great-uncle's journals revealed more details about the nature of the covenant. The Mishinimaki had not simply appeased the creature beneath Wanagiska. They had utilized its power, drawing on it for protection against enemies and harsh winters. The arrangement had been symbiotic rather than purely sacrificial. Over generations, this knowledge had been lost or deliberately obscured. My ancestors had maintained only the bare minimum of the tradition, the offerings, the maintenance of the stone markers, without understanding the full complexity of the relationship. Another discovery proved crucial. The mask itself was not merely a symbol, but a conduit, carved from wood that had absorbed the shaman's blood during the original binding ritual. It served as both lock and key to the sleeper's prison and power. As the first true light of dawn filtered through the trees, I reached a decision. Not a perfect solution, but one that might break the cycle without unleashing catastrophe. I picked up the mask, feeling its unnatural weight and the subtle vibration of power contained within its wooden form. Standing before the stone shrine, I addressed both the unseen presence beneath the lake and the guardian that now watched with unblinking intensity. I accept the covenant, I said clearly, but I propose new terms. The guardian shifted, head tilting in what might have been curiosity. From the lake came a faint ripple, acknowledgement of my words. No more human sacrifices. No more deaths. I placed the mask on the pedestal but didn't remove my hands from it. Instead, I offer a permanent binding. My bloodline, tied to this place. Not just as caretakers, but as true guardians. The mental voice returned, probing my thoughts with cold precision. What sustenance would you provide in place of life essence? Regular offerings of more humane nature. And something more valuable. Purpose. Understanding. I'll study the old ways, restore the knowledge that's been lost. Make this relationship beneficial to both sides. as it once was. Silence stretched, pregnant with deliberation. The guardian remained motionless, but I sensed its attention was divided between me and something I couldn't perceive. Communication with its master below. The hunger cannot be denied entirely. Then let it feed on willing sacrifices, blood freely given, not lives taken. The Mishinimaki shamans used their own blood to seal the original covenant. Another long pause. The sunrise painted the clearing in golden light, illuminating details that darkness had hidden. Intricate carvings on the stone shrine, patterns worn into the ground from centuries of ritual movement around the circle. It is acceptable, if imperfect. The binding will hold, sustained by willing sacrifice and renewed purpose. But know this, guardian by choice. Should you fail in your duty, should your blood cease to renew the covenant, what sleeps will wake, and what wakes will remember this mercy denied. I understand. I pressed my palm against the mask's wooden surface, feeling a sharp sting as hidden splinters pierced my skin. Blood welled, soaking into the ancient wood, which seemed to absorb it eagerly. I accept the responsibility. A sensation like an electrical current passed through my body, not painful but overwhelming, as if every cell was being examined and catalogued. Knowledge flowed into my mind, fragments of ritual, glimpses of the sleeper's true nature, the history of the Mishinimaki and their centuries of guardianship. When it ended, I stumbled backward, gasping. The mask on the pedestal glowed briefly with inner light, then returned to its weathered appearance, though subtle changes had occurred. The features slightly altered to incorporate something of my own face. The guardian stepped into the clearing for the first time, approaching with fluid grace that belied its massive bulk. In daylight I could see it clearly, the shaggy brown-gray fur, the massive hands with surprisingly dexterous fingers, the face that blended human and animal features in unsettling proportion. Its eyes, no longer glowing red but a deep amber, studied me with intelligence far beyond that of any natural creature. It stopped before me, towering at its full height, at least 9 feet tall. Then, in a gesture that seemed both benediction and warning, it placed one enormous hand briefly on my shoulder. The weight was staggering, forcing me to brace myself, but also oddly comforting, an acknowledgement of shared purpose. Then it turned and moved back toward the forest with that same unnatural grace, pausing at the edge to look back once before disappearing among the trees. I returned to the cabin, which showed evidence of the night's upheaval. Foundation cracks, buckled floors, broken windows, but remained structurally sound. Inside, I gathered my great-uncle's journals and the family documents, now mine to study and expand upon. The responsibility I'd inherited was far greater than a piece of property. It was the continuation of an ancient pact that predated European settlement of this continent. Over the following weeks, I repaired the cabin and established my new life as guardian of Lake Wanagiska. True to my word, I studied the old ways, deciphering rituals from fragmented descriptions, and experimenting cautiously with the connection I now felt to both guardian and sleeper. The locals regarded me with a mixture of wariness and respect when I ventured into town. They never spoke directly of what had happened, but the old man from the store nodded to me with what seemed like approval. "Your uncle would be pleased," he said once, the closest anyone came to acknowledging the change. I learned to hear the whispers of the forest, to sense the guardian's movements through the trees, to feel the rhythmic breathing of the sleeper beneath the lake. Each morning, I made a small offering of my own blood, just a few drops in a stone bowl placed at the shrine, renewing the covenant and maintaining the balance. Hikers and campers occasionally passed through the outer boundaries of the property, unaware of what lay at its heart. I guided them subtly away from the lake, becoming known locally as the helpful but eccentric hermit who knew the woods better than anyone. Sometimes when the moon is full and the lake perfectly still, I sit on the dock and feel the ancient presence stirring far below. Not with hunger now, but with a patient awareness. Waiting. Dreaming of depths no human mind can comprehend. And sometimes in those moments, I catch glimpses of my great-uncle's spirit. Not as a ghost, but as an echo absorbed into the entity he sacrificed himself to contain. He made his choice to protect others. I made mine to find a better way. The Guardian still walks the perimeter each night, its massive footprints occasionally visible in the morning dew. We acknowledge each other when we meet. Neither friend nor enemy, but bound by purpose to this place of ancient power. I am the last of my bloodline, and so the covenant will end with me. But I have time to find an apprentice, someone willing to accept this strange inheritance when I can no longer maintain it. Someone who will make their own offering, their own terms with what whispers beneath Wanagiska. For now, I maintain my vigil. I honor the pact. And I listen to the whispers of things older than human history, learning secrets few will ever know. This is my inheritance. This is my purpose. This is my covenant with the darkness that dreams beneath white shadow waters.